The cold marble presses against his knees. Dan opens his eyes and doesn't know where he is. Teenagers in identical gray robes stand all around him. One after another, golden plaques light up above their heads. C-rank warrior, D-rank fire mage, B-rank spearman. Each new inscription is met with shouts and applause. A guy in an expensive doublet is awarded the title of spearman, and his family screams with delight so loudly that the walls shake. Dan stands there, unable to move. His body feels foreign. His arms are thin. His shoulders are narrow. His legs are like a child's. The last thing he remembers is a burning car on the highway in Sacramento and a piece of rebar flying toward his neck. He remembers holding the hand of a guy with an open hip fracture. He remembers telling him, "Breathe with me, buddy. 1, 2, 1, 2. And then darkness. And then this hall. Marble columns, the smell of incense, and 30 teenagers surrounding him, the first time he's ever seen them. An inscription flashes above Dan's head. It isn't gold, it's pale gray. Healer. F rank. HP 40. MP 15. The hall falls silent for a second. Then someone snorts. Then laughter breaks out. A guy in a doublet turns around and says he'll at least hand out the bandages. The abbot in white robes looks away. Dan stands there and listens to the laughter. He feels no resentment. Inside him, there is silence. That very silence that sets in during the third year of 24-hour shifts, when you stop reacting to other people's screams and just start working. He blinks. He scans the room. A girl in the third row, a tremor in her right hand, slight but rhythmic. Malnutrition, most likely a magnesium deficiency. The abbot, a yellow tinge to the whites of her eyes. Liver, possibly the early stages of cirrhosis. The security guard at the door, his right leg, swelling above the boot, long-standing, swollen, a deep vein thrombosis. If left untreated, in a couple of weeks the clot will break loose and travel to the lungs. Dan takes a deep breath. He exhales, and a single thought crosses his mind. There's a lot of work to do. Good. He turns to the abbot and says he thanks the Holy Father and asks where he should go. The abbot replies, somewhat flustered, that he can go wherever he wants. Dan nods, and he doesn't head for the exit. Not toward the tables with refreshments for the awakened. He walks toward the guard at the door, because a blood clot won't wait. The guard looks down at the skinny boy with gray lettering above his head. Dan drops to one knee and, without asking, places his palm on the guard's right shin, right over his boot. The guard flinches. Dan feels something click inside him, as if a lens has snapped into place. He sees, not with his eyes, with something else. The veins in the leg stand out before him, as if on an ultrasound screen. The blood clot is lodged in the popliteal vein, solid, old, ready to break loose. Dan pulls his hand away and lifts his head. The guard has already raised his fist. Dan tells him calmly that he has a blood clot in his right leg. He says the guard can't stand on duty. He says the guard needs to lie down and raise his leg above his head, and that he needs an alchemist who knows how to make blood-thinning concoctions. He says that if he doesn't do this, he might die in 10 days. The guard lowers his fist. He stares at Dan for a long time. Then he looks at his own leg. He knows it's been hurting for 3 months now. He knows his leg is swollen. He simply couldn't afford a healer. A real healer. The kind with a golden inscription and a price tag of 100 gold pieces per visit. The boy standing before him is wearing a government-issued robe, and his profession is the most pitiful of all. But he has just described his pain more accurately than any doctor ever has in his entire life. The guard slowly sinks to the floor. Dan turns around and scans the area for one of the temple servants. He spots a boy of about 12 who's staring at him. Dan tells him to run to the nearest alchemist and say he needs white willow bark and dried sweet clover. He says it's urgent. The boy runs off. Dan bends down to the guard again and begins carefully pulling off his boot. The guard hisses in pain. Dan tells him to breathe steadily. 1, 2, 1, 2. The same words, the same calm. Another world, another body, the same work. In the hall behind him, people are still laughing and congratulating one another. No one is looking toward the door. No one sees the pale inscription flickering above the head of the skinny boy in the gray robe. HP 40, MP 15. But something inside the system has shifted. Something has started counting. The next morning, Dan is summoned to see the abbot. He's told that the temple doesn't keep the awakened after the ceremony. He's given a small pouch with 5 copper coins and shown the door. The abbot says the young man could try to find work at the apothecary or the laundry at the barracks. Dan takes the coins and asks how the guard is doing. The abbot blinks. He says the guard is in the infirmary and that the alchemist confirmed a blood clot. He says that if it weren't for the boy, the guard might have died within a week. The abbot looks at Dan strangely, but the door closes behind him anyway. The capital of Wayran greets him with dirt and noise. The lower market is teeming with people. Merchants are shouting, guards patrol in pairs. Colorful plaques flash above their heads every now and then. Warriors, mages, archers. Everyone's rank is visible as a patch on their jacket. Dan makes his way through the crowd, his gray F-rank insignia like a brand. People look away. An F-rank healer, the lowest of the low. Even the beggars look at him with pity. Dan notices a crowd gathered around a fish stall. People have gathered in a circle. Someone is shouting that they need an air mage. Dan pushes his way forward. A woman in her 50s is lying on the ground, a fishmonger. Her face is blue. Her lips are gray. She's wheezing. Her arms are clasped together. A B-rank mage runs over. A golden plaque glows above her head. She bends down toward the woman and sends a stream of air into her mouth. The woman turns even bluer. Dan sees it all in a split second. It's not suffocation. It's not a blocked airway. It's cardiac arrest. He pushes past the mage and says the woman isn't suffocating. He says her heart has stopped. The sorceress turns and looks at his gray badge. She tells him to get lost. Dan doesn't listen. He drops to his knees. He places his palms under her sternum, and he begins. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The crowd falls silent. Then they start giggling. Someone says the boy is massaging the old woman. Dan doesn't hear them. He's counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The rhythm is precise. Depth, 5 centimeters. Rate, 100 per minute. Everything just as he was taught. Everything just like on the 1,000 calls before this. First cycle, nothing. Second, nothing. Third, no pulse. Fourth cycle. The woman takes a raspy breath. Her eyes fly open. Dan doesn't stop. He checks for a pulse on her neck. There is one. Weak, but there. He turns his head and says he needs someone to run to the pharmacy. He tells her to say it's a heart attack and that she needs hawthorn tincture and rest. He tells her to run. The witch stands there with her mouth agape. An old hunter with a weather-beaten face steps out of the crowd. He silently places his hand on Dan's shoulder, and he runs off. The woman lies there, breathing. Her face slowly turns pink. She opens her eyes and looks at Dan. She whispers one word. Son. Dan doesn't answer. He checks her pupils. They're even. He checks her nails. They're turning pink. He checks her breathing. It's steady. Above his head, the system ticks silently. HP went from 40 to 58. MP went from 15 to 24. Strength +1. He doesn't see that. He only sees that her breathing is steady. He tells the woman to lie down and that he'll wait with her. And he waits. He sits on the dirty stones of the market next to the fish vendor and counts her pulse. The B-rank mage left without looking back. The crowd dispersed. The old hunter returned with the herbal infusion. Dan gave the woman small sips of it. She fell asleep. The hunter sat down beside him and silently handed Dan half of his flatbread. Dan took it. They sat and ate while the vendor slept. The hunter didn't ask how the boy knew such things. He didn't ask why an F-rank healer had saved a man whom a B-rank mage hadn't been able to save. He just sat there beside him, and that was enough. 3 days in the capital taught Dan everything he needed to know about the world of Erden. The Healers Guild was closed to F-rank healers without a family lineage. He made it to the reception hall, but they wouldn't even let him cross the threshold. The secretary looked at his gray badge and said there were no openings. Dan asked if he could at least work as an apprentice. The secretary laughed and closed the door. Pharmacies only hire alchemists with guild certification. The infirmaries at the barracks only accept those recommended by the college. It's a vicious cycle. You're an F-rank healer, which means you're a nobody. The system has decided you're weak. The world agreed. Dan spent the night in an alley behind the market, wrapped in a burlap blanket. On the second day, he took a part-time job as a loader at the fish pier. He earned 2 copper coins and a bowl of porridge. On the third day, he saw a boy of about 7 limping along the cobblestones, dragging his right leg. Dan called out to him. The boy flinched. Dan crouched down and said he just wanted to look at his leg. The boy shook his head. Dan didn't press the issue. He pulled the last piece of flatbread out of his pocket and held it out. The boy took it. While the boy was chewing, Dan quietly touched his ankle. His diagnostic gaze kicked in instantly. A fracture. An old one. It had healed improperly. The bone had set at an angle and was digging into the muscle with every step. The pain was excruciating, but the boy had grown used to it. Dan placed both hands on his ankle and concentrated. Something stirred inside him. Warm. Heavy. Like thick honey flowing through his veins. Mana. There wasn't much of it. 15 units was a laughably small reserve. But Dan wasn't trying to fuse the bone with magic. He directed the mana precisely. He cleared the inflammation around the nerve. He eased the pressure of the bone on the muscle. He didn't heal it completely. He just made it more bearable. The boy froze. Then he stood up and stepped on his foot. His eyes widened. He looked at Dan. He turned around and ran. For the first time in God knows how long, the boy ran. A notification flashed above Dan's head. HP +2. MP +1. Trivial. Dust. But the system counted it. That evening, Dan made a decision. There was nothing for him to do in the capital. Here, healers with golden plaques treated aristocrats for hundreds of gold pieces. Here, a B-rank mage can't tell the difference between suffocation and cardiac arrest. Here, a boy with a misaligned fracture limps for years because his mother can't afford a doctor. But he'd overheard the dockworkers' conversations. The south and east are deserted. The villages have been abandoned. The guilds have flocked to the capital's A-rank vaults, where the spoils are plentiful and the glory resounds. And the distant villages are dying quietly, without doctors, without hunters, without hope. Dan spent his remaining coins at the lower market. He bought an old traveling cloak with patches on the elbows, a box for herbs, linen bandages, a bundle of dried yarrow, a bottle of alcohol tincture, a bone needle and suit thread. It was a meager supply. The medical kit from his past life would have cost a fortune here, but Dan knew how to make do with what little he had. He left the capital's southern gate at dawn on the 4th day. The guard at the gate glanced at his gray mark and didn't bother checking his papers. An F-rank healer leaving town. Who cares? The road south turned out to be worse than he'd expected. For the first 2 days, he still came across villages with inns and wells. Then the villages grew fewer and farther between. Houses stood with boarded-up windows. The fields were overgrown. Abandoned carts with rusty wheels lay by the roadside. The world beyond the capital was dying, and no one cared. On the 5th day of his journey, Dan heard a scream. He turned off the road and found a peasant in the ditch, a man in his 40s. His right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, an open fracture of the forearm. The bone was sticking out of the skin. Blood had soaked the ground around him. An overturned wheelbarrow loaded with firewood lay nearby. The man was conscious, but his eyes were glazed over from pain shock. Dan dropped the box. He dropped to his knees. His hands moved on their own. 10 years of muscle memory didn't ask his new body for permission. Assessment. Pulse in the radial artery. Weak, but present. The bleeding isn't arterial. Good. No tourniquet needed. Immobilization and disinfection are needed. He rinsed the wound with alcohol tincture. The man let out a howl. Dan told him to breathe. 1, 2. 1, 2. He set the bone. The man lost consciousness. That was even better. Dan made a splint out of straight branches and wrapped it with bandages. Then he placed his hands on the wound and channeled his mana. That warm, heavy flow again. 15 units. He'd used almost all of it to reduce the inflammation and kickstart regeneration. Not a complete healing, just a boost for the body. Time and proper immobilization would do the rest. The man woke up 20 minutes later. He looked at his arm. He looked at Dan. He couldn't believe his hand was still there and the pain was gone. The man's name was Beck. He'd been hauling firewood from the forest when his wheelbarrow tipped over on a rock. He'd been lying in the ditch for 3 hours. No one had stopped. 3 hours on a road where at least 2 horsemen and 1 merchant's wagon had passed by. Buck said he had a wife and 2 children at home. He said that if his arm hadn't healed, he wouldn't have been able to chop wood, and his family wouldn't have survived the winter. Dan helped him walk to the nearest village. The village was called Speckled Bend. 6 houses, a well, a crooked fence around the vegetable gardens. Buck's wife ran out to meet them. She saw her husband with his arm in a sling. She saw a skinny boy standing next to him. She ushered them both into the house. She served them some soup. Dan ate and listened. Buck told his wife how the boy had set his bone with his bare hands. His wife stared at the gray mark above Dan's head and couldn't believe it. The next morning, Beck's neighbor came to see Dan. Her daughter had had a fever and diarrhea for 3 days. Dan went with her. The girl was 4 years old. Dehydration, high fever, dysentery. In his former world, this is treated in a week with antibiotics and rehydration. Here, people die from it. Dan made a solution of boiled water with salt and honey. He made the mother give the girl small sips every 10 minutes. He directed his mana at the intestines. Precisely. Carefully. He eliminated the source of the inflammation. 2 days later, the girl was sitting on the porch eating porridge. Then people came with a child from the neighboring house. Then more. Dan spent 5 days in Spotted Glimmer. He cured 7 people. A broken bone, dysentery, a fever. a festering wound on an old man's leg, a dislocated shoulder in a teenager, a chronic cough in an old woman that turned out to be the early stage of pneumonia, a chronic burn on the blacksmith's son that hadn't healed in 3 months because the boy kept climbing into the forge every day. Each treatment drained every last drop of his mana. Every time, he'd go to bed afterward and sleep for 12 hours. Every time he woke up, he felt he had a little more mana than he had the day before. His HP was rising, his MP was rising, his strength was increasing by 1 point. A small thing, but Dan began to notice. On the 5th day, he lifted a log that Beck could barely roll with his good arm. He lifted it with one hand, and froze. He looked at the log. He looked at his hand, a thin, boyish hand, and didn't understand. He thanked the residents of Speckled Bend and continued south. Behind him lay the village where, for the first time in 2 years, no one was sick. On the road, he came across a woman in labor. She was riding in a wagon when her contractions began right there on the road. Her husband was running around, shouting. Dan stopped the wagon. He examined the woman. The baby was in the correct position, but the woman was exhausted and dehydrated. Dan delivered the baby on the side of the road. A boy. Healthy. He was screaming so loudly that the birds flew up from the trees. The mother was crying. The father knelt there, not knowing what to say. Dan tied off the umbilical cord. He wiped the baby down, wrapped him in a clean cloth, and moved on. A counter ticked above his head. HP 210, MP 90. He still couldn't see it. To the outside world, he remained the same, an F-rank healer. HP 40, MP 15. Trash. Dan walked along the empty road, thinking about Huamacol. He'd heard that name from Beck, a village in the very south. A year ago, the guilds had left there. The healer had died last winter. The people were holding on, but they wouldn't last much longer. Dan quickened his pace. Huamacol looked like a village that had already died but forgotten to fall. 20 houses, half of them with sagging roofs. The fence around the village was cobbled together from whatever was at hand. Logs, barn doors, old shields. There were claw marks on the fence. Dan stopped at the gate and looked at the marks. Long, deep, a creature from the rift. Not large, but not small either. An old man with an axe came out of the gate. Gaunt, withered, a beard down to his waist, eyes like 2 nails driven into a board. He looked at Dan's gray mark and his face soured. The old man said they didn't need another mouth to feed. He said the healer had died last winter and they'd been fending for themselves ever since. He said that if the boy was looking for a handout, he should move along. Dan didn't argue. He said he didn't need gold. He said he needed a roof over his head and food. He said he'd treat people for free. The old man stared at him for about 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't close the door. Dan took that as an invitation. The old man's name was Yoon Gisop, the head of Huamacol, 62 years old, a former D-rank hunter. His left knee had been shattered 30 years ago by a creature from the rift. He'd been limping ever since. Dan figured this out within the first 2 hours. Not because the old man told him. The old man didn't speak to him at all. Dan figured it out by watching. His gait, the angle of his body, the compensatory shift of weight to his right leg. The wear on his right boot was 3 times worse than on the left. Diagnosis starts with the eyes, then the hands, then magic. On the first day, Dan just walked around the village and watched. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't impose himself on anyone. He just watched. By evening, he had a list of 23 people. 6 had serious problems. 14 had moderate problems. 3 were critical. The first critical case was a 7-year-old girl with pneumonia. Her mother was holding her close and wouldn't let her leave the house. Dan came to their door and said he wanted to examine the child. The mother slammed the door shut. Dan sat down on the porch and waited. An hour later, the door opened. The mother stood in the doorway, her eyes red. She said her daughter had been running a fever for 3 days and that they didn't have money for a doctor from town. Dan said he didn't need any money. He went inside. The girl was lying on a bench, small, pale. Her breathing was wheezy. Her fever was so high that her skin felt scorching to the touch. Dan placed his hand on her chest, a diagnostic glance. Her lungs were congested. The right one was worse than the left, a bacterial infection. In his former world, 3 days of antibiotics and that would be it. Here, there were no antibiotics, but there was mana. Dan directed the flow precisely into her right lung. Not a diffuse cloud, as they teach in the college's textbooks. Precise, targeted, like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He found the source of the infection and began to press down on it with mana, cell by cell. It was like scrubbing the floor with a toothbrush. Slow, tedious, but precise. An hour later, it was clear. His mana was depleted. The right lung was 1/3 clear. That wasn't enough, but the girl was already feeling better. Her breathing was a little easier. Her temperature was slightly lower. Dan told the mother to give her daughter warm water with honey. He said he'd be back tomorrow. He left. He walked to the shed they'd assigned him. He lay down on the straw and passed out. He woke up 10 hours later. His mana had recovered. He went back. Second session. The right lung was clear. He started on the left one. Another hour of work until he was completely exhausted. Then sleep again. On the third day, the girl sat up in bed and asked for something to eat. Her mother stood in the doorway and cried. Dan checked her lungs. They were clear. Her temperature was normal. Her breathing was steady. He told the mother she needed to keep the girl warm and feed her hot meals for another week. The mother grabbed his hand and wouldn't let go for a minute. She just held it and said nothing. Dan let her. HP +8. MP +6. Strength +2. Resonance didn't work. For now. The village wasn't his yet. The second critical case turned out to be more serious. A hunter. A 35-year-old man. He was lying in his house by the gate. His wife said that a month ago, a creature from the rift had wounded him, with its claws on his stomach. The wound had been stitched up but wasn't healing. It was festering. His temperature keeps fluctuating. Dan walked into the room, and his nose immediately picked up the smell. He knew that smell. In his past life, it had made even veteran paramedics wince. Gangrene. No, not exactly. Dan placed his hand on the hunter's stomach. A diagnostic glance. The wound was stitched up on the outside. Inside, it wasn't closed. An internal abscess the size of a fist. The pus was pressing on the intestines. Another week and sepsis would set in. Then no amount of mana would help. Dan turned to the hunter's wife. He told her he needed to cut him open. He explained that the wound inside wasn't closed and that the pus had to be drained. The wife turned pale. She asked if he couldn't just use magic. Dan shook his head. He said there wouldn't be enough mana to handle an infection of that magnitude. He said they needed to cut it open and drain it, and then use magic to close the clean wound. The hunter's wife looked at the gray F-rank mark above Dan's head. She looked at her husband, who was tossing and turning in a fever. She nodded. Dan told her to boil a knife, to cut up some clean rags, to bring boiling water and alcohol tincture. While she was preparing everything, he sat down next to the hunter and placed his hand on the man's forehead. The man opened his eyes. They were cloudy and feverish. Dan told him it was going to hurt. He told him to breathe steadily. 1, 2. 1, 2. The hunter nodded. Dan cut. Carefully, along the old suture line. The pus came out immediately. A lot of it. The hunter's wife turned away and threw up. Dan worked without stopping. He rinsed out the cavity, treated it with tincture. The hunter screamed. Then he fell silent. He lost consciousness from the pain. Dan rinsed and cleaned for another half hour. Then, when the cavity was clean, he placed both hands on the wound and channeled his mana. All of it. Precisely. To the inner edges of the wound, not on the skin, on the muscles and the intestinal wall. The tissues began to contract, slowly, with difficulty. His mana ran out before he finished, but 2/3 of the internal wound had closed. He sutured the rest with a needle and sinew, by hand, like a paramedic. Dan left the house 3 hours later. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows. His face was pale with exhaustion. Grandpa Yoon Gaisup was standing by the porch. He looked at him. He didn't say a word. Dan said the hunter would live. He said the bandages needed to be changed twice a day and that the hunter should drink plenty of water. He said that in 3 days he would open the stitches and check them. The old man remained silent for another 10 seconds. Then he turned toward his house and muttered that dinner was on the table. It was the first time Grandfather Yoon had invited him to eat. Dan ate but couldn't taste a thing. He felt only fatigue, that very same familiar kind. The third critical case. A 70-year-old woman. She's going blind in both eyes. Cataracts. Dan diagnosed it in a minute. He couldn't cure it with magic. Not the right mana profile. Not the right subtlety of influence. Not yet, anyway. He told the old woman he couldn't restore her sight just yet. He said that when he could, he'd come back. The old woman smiled and said she'd wait. Dan remembered. During his first month in Vamakol, he healed 17 people. A girl with pneumonia, a hunter with an abscess, 3 children with parasites, a woman with uterine bleeding, an old man with broken ribs, 4 with skin infections, 2 with fever. A teenager with a dislocation. A man with kidney stones, which he shattered with mana over 3 consecutive sessions. And the village headman's wife, who turned out to have a stomach ulcer, which Dan diagnosed by the color of her nails and the smell of her breath before he even touched her. After that, Grandfather Yoon called him by name for the first time. Not boy, Dan. The system calculated. HP 380, MP 170. His strength was growing, and for the first time, resonance activated. The village became his. Hwamakol accepted the outsider, and the growth doubled. The hunter's name was Sojin. A week after the operation, he was back on his feet. 2 weeks later, he was walking around the yard. 3 weeks later, he picked up his bow and went out through the gate. Dan told him it was too soon. Sojin replied that his family wanted to eat. He went into the forest at dawn and returned in the evening with 2 hares. Dan examined his stitches. Clean, no inflammation. The internal wound had healed completely. Sojin's body turned out to be tougher than Dan had thought. A D-rank hunter, not the strongest, but resilient. Sojin silently placed 1 hare on the table in front of Dan. It wasn't a gift. It was a debt. Dan understood and accepted it. That evening, he ate meat for the first time in a month and a half. Sogin had a daughter, Yuna Sogin, 17 years old, a D-rank tracker. She came to see Dan on the 3rd day after her father was back on his feet. She came in silence. She stood in the doorway of his shed. She watched. She had a braid swept to one side and a scar across her left eyebrow. Her hands were calloused from the bowstring. Her eyes were like a cat's, alert and distrustful. She said she wanted to know how he'd treated her father. Dan said, with a knife and his hands. Yuna asked, "Not with magic?" Dan said, "With magic too, but first with a knife." Yuna was silent for a moment. Then she said that 2 years ago, her younger brother had died in her arms. A creature from the rift had slashed his side. Yuna had carried him 4 kilometers to the village. He bled out halfway there. She hadn't made it all the way. She hadn't slept properly since then. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for 10 seconds. Then he asked what the wound looked like. Yuna described it. Deep, from his rib to his hip. Blood was gushing out. Dan nodded. He told her that with a wound of that depth and length, the maximum time before fatal blood loss was 15 minutes. 4 kilometers through the woods is at least 40 minutes of running, even without a load. An hour with a wounded person on your back. He said that even if she'd run twice as fast, she wouldn't have made it in time. He said it wasn't that she hadn't saved him. No one could have saved him. Yuna stood there and looked at him. Then her face crumpled like a piece of paper. She began to cry. For the first time in 2 years. Not sobbing. Quietly. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She just stood there and cried. Dan didn't move. He didn't try to hug her. He didn't say any comforting words. He just stood beside her and waited. When she stopped crying, she wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Dan. She said she'd show him the woods around the village tomorrow. She turned and walked away. From that day on, Yuna walked with him. She showed him the trails, places where medicinal herbs grew, streams with clear water, a hill from which you could see the approaches to the village, and the rift. The rift was a 3-hour walk to the south. It was small, rank E. Small creatures would occasionally crawl out of it, goblins, slimes, and small wolves with red eyes. The village hunters were handling them, for now at least. Yuna said the rift was growing. 2 years ago, it was the size of a door. Now, a wagon could drive through it. Dan remembered. During the day, he healed. In the evenings, he studied with the villagers. He watched the hunters, how they moved, how they held their weapons, how they read tracks. When he had fully healed Sojin, the system granted him an imprint. It happened at night. Dan was asleep when suddenly his body jerked. His muscles tensed for a second. He woke up and his hands already knew. They knew how to draw the bowstring, how to feel the wind's direction with his skin, how to place his foot on soft ground so a twig wouldn't snap. Someone else's knowledge, a shadow of Sogin's skills. Faint, that of a student, but real. The next day, Dan asked Yuna for an old bow. She handed it to him with a smirk. A healer with a bow. Funny. Dan pulled the bowstring taut. His fingers fell into place correctly. He didn't understand where he'd learned it himself. He aimed at a tree trunk. He shot. The arrow stuck into the target from 20 paces away. Not right in the center, but in the tree, on the first try. Yuna stopped smirking. Dan looked at his hands and felt uneasy. These hands belonged to a 16-year-old orphan who, just 3 months ago, had been turned away at the door of a pharmacy. Now they were shooting a bow and arrow. He handed the bow to Yuna and said nothing. A month after his arrival in Huamacol, Yuna brought people from a neighboring village to see him. Speckled Bend. Those very people. Beck and his wife. And 4 others. They'd walked for 2 days. They said there was a plague in the village. A fever. 6 people were sick. 2 children were in critical condition. Dan asked what the symptoms were. Fever, rash, joint pain, vomiting. He recognized the pattern instantly. Typhus. Or its local counterpart. Spread through water. That meant the well was contaminated. Dan packed a box. He looked at Yuna's grandfather. The old man was standing on the porch, watching. Dan said he was leaving for a few days. He said there was an epidemic in Spotted Bend. The old man pursed his lips. Then he said one word. Come back. Dan nodded. Yuna went with him. He didn't ask her to. She didn't ask for permission. She simply slung her bow over her shoulder and stood beside him. It was a 2-day journey. Yuna walked in silence. Dan walked and thought. In his past life, typhus was treated with antibiotics. There were no antibiotics here. There was manna. There were herbs. There were hands. That should be enough. In Spotted Bend, things were worse than he'd thought. Not 6, 11 people were lying there. 2 children were in very bad shape, a 5-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Dan started with the well. He climbed down and saw a dead rat, the source. He pulled the carcass out. He poured all the remaining alcohol tincture into the well. He forbade anyone from drinking from it for a week. He ordered them to carry water from a stream 2 kilometers upstream. Then he began his rounds. 11 patients in 3 days, 4 mana sessions a day, each time until complete exhaustion. Each time, sleep. Wake up. Back to work. Yuna stayed by his side. She didn't know how to heal, but she knew how to boil water, wash bandages, carry herbal decoctions from house to house, make sure the children drank. She did it silently and precisely, like a soldier. On the second day, a 3-year-old boy began to choke. His fever spiked so high that he started having convulsions. His mother screamed. Dan placed his hands on the child and channeled mana. A lot. Too much for his current reserves. He felt something snap inside him. The mana was gone. Completely. Down to 0. The boy was breathing. The convulsions had stopped. Dan tried to stand up and fell. Yuna caught him. He weighed as much as a child in this body. She laid him on a bench and covered him with her cloak. He slept for 16 hours. When he woke up, the boy was sitting on his mother's lap, drinking broth. Dan checked him. The fever had subsided. The rash was fading. On the 3rd day, he nursed the last patient back to health. He stood in the middle of the village and looked around. 6 houses. A crooked fence. Beck, with his arm in a sling, stood on the porch watching him. His wife brought Dan a bowl of porridge and a piece of bread. Dan ate and counted. In 3 days in Speckled Bend, the system had given him more than in a month in Huamacol. Resonance. 1 misfortune. 1 community. Double the gain. HP 520. MP 240. His strength was growing. And a new imprint. Weak, barely noticeable. An imprint from the woman he had treated. A midwife. Now his hands knew how to deliver a baby. Not from a book. From someone else's memory. Dan returned to Huamacol with Yuna. Grandfather Yoon stood at the gate. He looked at them. Then, for the first time in all those weeks, he placed his hand on Dan's shoulder. Heavy. Warm. He said one word. Well done. Rumors spread more slowly than a creature from the rift, but they travel farther. 3 months after Dan arrived in Huamacol, 4 villages had heard of him. An F-rank healer. A young boy. He treats people for free. He cuts with a knife. He gets those who've already been written off back on their feet. He says strange things about boiling water and washing hands, but he heals. People walk to him for 2 or 3 days. Dan set up a route. A weekly round. Huamacol, Speckled Bend, Olkovi Yar Village, Sukaya Rechka Settlement. 4 stops, just like a country doctor. He'd get up before dawn and set out. He'd treat patients. He'd keep going. He'd treat more patients. He'd return. He'd go to sleep. He'd get up. He'd set out again. Yuna walked with him, always a step behind, a bow on her back, eyes darting from side to side. She didn't say why. He didn't ask. In Okovyar, a man had appendicitis. Dan diagnosed it in 10 seconds. He placed his hand on the man's abdomen. A diagnostic glance revealed a swollen appendix ready to burst. In a past life, this would have been an operating room and a surgeon. Here, it was him. His knife. His hands. His 400 mana points. He cut by the light of a torch. Yuna held the patient down. The patient's wife handed him rags. Dan opened the abdominal cavity. He found the appendix. He ligated it. He cut it off. He cauterized the wound with mana. He sutured it up. 3 hours of work. The man survived. He was back on his feet a week later. A imprint. The man turned out to be a former carpenter. Now Dan's hands knew how to hold a plane and lay logs in a log cabin. Useless in battle, priceless in construction. He began to think about the medical station. The 4th month. Dan returned from his rounds and saw an unfamiliar figure at the gate of Kvamakol. A girl. Young. 16, maybe 17. Expensive clothes. Torn. Dirty. A cloak made of fine fabric but covered in burrs. Leather boots, but worn down to holes. She stood there looking at the gate like someone who had reached the end of the road and didn't know what to do next. Dan approached. The girl turned around. A fair face. A high forehead. Eyes weary to the core. Above her head, a golden plaque. B-rank light mage. Dan blinked. B-rank. Out here in the middle of nowhere. The girl looked at his gray badge, then at his box of herbs, then at him. She said she was looking for a healer. She said she'd heard there was someone in Huamakal who could heal. Dan said that was him. The girl looked at the F-rank badge. She looked at him. Doubt flashed across her face. Then despair. Then determination. She rolled up her sleeve. On her right forearm was a deep cut, a long one, inflamed. The edges were green, an infection. Dan took her hand, a diagnostic glance. The infection had gone deep. 2 more days and sepsis would set in. He told her to come with him. He led her to his shed. He washed the wound, treated it. He directed his mana precisely at the source of the infection. He pressed on it for 20 minutes. The girl sat there in silence. She didn't flinch once. Patient. Or perhaps accustomed to pain. When he finished, he bandaged her arm and told her to change the bandage twice a day. She asked how much it cost. He said it wouldn't cost a thing. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said her name was Hannah Pektan. Dan didn't recognize the name. Yuna did. When Dan told her the girl's name that evening, Yuna dropped her mug. Pektan. One of the 5 great families of Weiran. The aristocracy. Dan asked what that meant. Yuna said that the Pektan family owns 1/4 of the healing licenses in the kingdom. She said that Hannah Pektan is Lord Pektan's only daughter. She said that 3 months ago, a rumor spread through the capital that Hannah Pektan had been betrothed to Duke Karan, the head of the College of Healers. She said that 2 weeks ago, a second rumor had spread. Hannah Pektan had run away from home. Dan glanced toward the shed where the girl had been sleeping. A B-rank aristocrat, a runaway, with a festering wound on her arm, in a village at the edge of the world. In the morning, Hannah came to him while he was changing the bandage on an old man with broken ribs. She stood there watching. Dan worked without paying any attention to her. The old man was lying on a bench. His ribs had almost healed. Dan was directing mana in a thin stream along the cracks in the bones. Hannah leaned in closer. She could see the mana. A B-rank mage can see others' mana. She saw how the stream entered the body at a specific point, how it found the fracture line, how it lay along it like a thread in a seam. She said she'd never seen anything like it. She said that at the college they teach a different way of healing. In a broad stream, pouring mana into the body like water into a pitcher. Dan said that way wastes 10 times as much mana. Hannah fell silent. She was thinking. Dan could see her thinking. Her eyebrows furrowed, her eyes narrowed. She was going over everything she'd been taught in her head and comparing it to what she'd seen. That evening, she came to him again. She said she wanted to understand how he did it. Dan looked at her. A B-rank light mage. According to the college's official doctrine, her magic was considered the highest form of healing. Beautiful golden light. It impresses the public. It's expensive. It heals poorly. Dan knew this because he'd seen the results. Half of the chronically ill people in the villages were patients who'd been treated by the college's healers. The golden light covered the wound on the outside, but didn't clear the infection inside. It relieved the pain, but didn't address the cause. It looked like a miracle. It worked like a Band-Aid on a broken bone. He told her to sit down. He took her hand, the healthy one. He turned her palm upward. He told her to close her eyes and direct the light toward her own finger. Hana did so. A golden glow enveloped her little finger. Beautiful. Dan asked what she felt. Hana said warmth. Dan said that wasn't the right answer. He said she should feel the bones, muscles, tendons, 2 blood vessels, nerve endings. Hana opened her eyes. Dan told her that the light was a tool, like a scalpel. You don't wave a scalpel around. You use a scalpel to make precise cuts. He said that if she learned to direct the light as a beam rather than a cloud, she'd be able to stop bleeding in seconds. Not to heal, to stop it. That's enough for a person to make it through to morning. Hana sat there, her eyes wide. Dan saw something in them that he recognized. That moment when a medical student first understands the difference between theory and practice. When the textbook ceases to be a sacred text and becomes an instruction manual that can be improved upon. Hana said she wanted to stay. She said she wanted to learn. Dan said there wasn't much food, and there was a lot of work. Hana said she knew how to learn, and that she'd learn to wash dishes too. She didn't know how. That became clear the next morning when she broke 3 bowls trying to wash them in the stream. Daku would have laughed, but Daku wasn't there yet. Yuna didn't laugh either. She stood off to the side and watched Hana. She was assessing her. A week later, Yuna told Dan that the aristocrat could be trusted. Dan asked why. Yuna said that for the 3rd day in a row, Hana had been getting up before dawn to practice directing light onto a splinter. The same splinter. 3 hours straight, until her fingers went numb. People who are just playing don't do that. Dan nodded. Hana was learning. Quickly. She was smart. Book smart. Well-educated. She knew anatomy from the college's textbooks. The problem was that the college's textbooks were wrong. Not false, incomplete. They described the body as a vessel for mana. Dan described the body as a system. Blood, nerves, organs, the connections between them, causes and effects. Hana absorbed his knowledge like dry earth absorbs water. Every evening, they sat in his shed, and he drew with charcoal on a blackboard. The structure of the heart, the circulatory system, how the lungs work, why infection spreads through the lymphatic system. Hana wrote everything down in a notebook she had sewn together from scraps of leather. A month later, she stopped the bleeding on her own for the first time in a child who had cut himself with a knife. She directed a thin beam of light precisely at the damaged blood vessel. She cauterized it. The child didn't even cry. Hana stood over him, her hands trembling. Not from fatigue, from realization. Her entire life up to that moment had been a lie. Everything she'd been taught at the Paktan household. All the majestic light magic her family took pride in. Empty glitter. A beautiful facade built on a rotten foundation. She could heal for real, not for show, not at a high cost, for real. And for that, she needed an F-rank boy from the workhouse. That evening, Hana sat by the fire and said nothing. Yuna sat across from her and was silent too. Dan was brewing a potion for the morning rounds. 3 people by the fire. The first core of something that didn't yet have a name. A gray icon flickered above Dan's head. F-rank, HP 40, MP 15. Beneath it lay the truth. HP 640, MP 310. The strength that allowed him to lift a fence log with one hand. 3 imprints. Tracker, midwife, carpenter. Trivial on their own. Together, no longer trivial. Dan stirred the brew and thought about the salt farms. He'd heard from Beck that things were really bad there. The rift was nearby. The creatures came every week. People are leaving. Soon, there will be nowhere left to go. He thought and made plans. The bypass route needed to be expanded. More helping hands were needed. Supplies were needed. People needed to be taught simple things. How to boil water. How to wash their hands. How to bandage wounds. How to apply splints. He couldn't be everywhere, but he could teach others to be where he wasn't. The first school. Not a school of magic. Not an academy for heroes. A school for people who don't want their neighbors to die from things they haven't died from since the 1920s. Hana looked up from the campfire and gazed at him. She said he had the look of someone who was building something in his mind. Solyanya Kutori greeted them with smoke, not from a stove, but the smell of burning. 3 houses on the outskirts stood blackened, their charred rafters exposed. The fence had been knocked down. The ground around it was raked with claw marks. The tracks led from the rift across the field straight to the village. Yuna crouched down and touched a track. It was fresh. 2 days at most. A large creature, 4 paws, claws as long as a palm. Dan surveyed the village. 12 houses, 9 still standing. People were peering out of the windows. No one came out. He walked to the nearest house and knocked. The door opened just wide enough for a hand. An eye. A woman's. Frightened. Dan said he was a healer. He said he'd come to help. The door slammed shut. He knocked on the next house. Same thing. And the next. People didn't believe him. They wouldn't open the door. They'd been abandoned for too long. Too often, they'd been promised help that never came. Eunice said it would take time. Hannah said he had to prove it. Dan said they had to find the wounded. They found them in the largest house in the center. The head man of the salt farms had gathered all the injured in one place. 7 people were lying on the floor. The smell of blood and pus hit Dan in the nose. He stepped inside. He looked around. A man with a torn shoulder, bandaged with dirty rags. An infection. A woman with burns on her arms and chest. A burning beam had fallen on her when the creature set the house on fire. 2 children. A boy of about 10 with a laceration on his thigh. A girl of about 6 with a broken arm. An old man with a crushed leg. A teenager with deep scratches on his back. And one more man. He was lying apart from the others. Quiet. Motionless. Dan approached him. He placed a hand on his chest. A diagnostic glance. Internal bleeding. His spleen was ruptured. He was bleeding internally. Slowly. It had been 3 days already. How was he still alive? Dan turned to Hannah. He told her to treat the burns. To direct the light precisely onto the damaged tissue. Not in a cloud. A beam. Just like they'd practiced. Hannah nodded. She turned pale but nodded. Without a word, Una began removing the dirty bandages from the man with the injured shoulder. She'd seen Dan do this dozens of times. Her hands knew the routine. Remove, rinse, treat, rebandage with clean bandages. Dan knelt down in front of the man with the ruptured spleen. This was the most complicated case since he'd woken up. In his past life, a patient like this would have been flown to the operating room by helicopter. Here, the operating room was the floor of a village house. He was the surgeon. There was no assistant. He placed both hands on the man's abdomen. He closed his eyes. His diagnostic gaze was at its sharpest. He could see every blood vessel, every tear. The spleen was torn in 3 places. Blood had filled the abdominal cavity. A liter, maybe more. In the past world, he would have said there was no chance. In this world, he had mana. A lot of mana. More than anyone could have guessed by looking at the gray F rank mark. He began. First, he stopped the bleeding. He directed his mana at the torn blood vessels, one by one. He cauterized them with mana, like a cautery. 1, 2, 3, 12 blood vessels, 20 minutes. The bleeding stopped. Then the spleen tissue. He sealed the edges of the tears with mana, slowly, carefully. The spleen is a delicate organ. One wrong move and it would fall apart. In his past life, they would have simply removed it. Here, he was trying to save it. Because without a spleen, immunity drops. And in a world without antibiotics, that's a death sentence within a year. An hour of work. 2. Mana flowed from him like water from a leaky bucket. HP 640. MP was dwindling. 300. 200. 100. 50. The spleen was sutured. 3 tears were closed. The tissue was holding. No bleeding. Blood remained in the abdominal cavity, a liter of dead blood that would soon begin to rot. There wouldn't be enough mana. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at Hannah. She was sitting next to the woman with burns. Her hands were trembling. Her face was wet with sweat. But the burns had been treated. Light lay over them in an even layer. Just right. Just as he'd taught her. Dan told her to come closer. He told her he needed her mana. Not light, mana. Pure energy. Hannah looked at him. She didn't know that was possible, to transfer mana to another person. There was nothing like that in the college textbooks. Dan told her to place her hand on his shoulder and just let the flow go. Don't direct it. Just let it go. Hannah placed her hand there. She closed her eyes. The mana began to flow. Warm. Golden. A lot of it. A B-rank mage has a whole different level of mana reserves. Dan accepted her mana and directed it into the man's body. Someone else's mana felt different. Brighter. Hotter. But obedient. He dissolved the clotted blood in the abdominal cavity. He turned it into a liquid that the body would excrete on its own through the kidneys within a week. The man groaned. His eyes opened. Cloudy, but alive. Dan told him to lie still and not move. He told him he would live. The man closed his eyes and fell asleep. Dan stood up. He started to stagger. Hannah caught him by the elbow. Una caught him from the other side. He stood between them, and the world swam before his eyes. Then he took a step. A second. He approached the boy with the wound on his thigh. He examined it. A laceration. Deep. but clean. Caused by a creature's claws. No infection yet. He rinsed it. He stitched it up. He used the last of his mana to trigger regeneration. He approached the old man with the crushed leg last. He looked. The leg was shattered below the knee. The bones were in fragments. The muscles were pulverized. In the past world, it would have been an amputation. Here, Dan was silent for a long time. Then he told the old man that he would save his leg, but walking would be difficult. The old man smiled wryly. He said that difficult was better than nothing. Dan spent 10 days in the salt farms. Every day he treated patients. Every evening he collapsed. Every morning he got back up. Hannah worked by his side. In those 10 days, she learned to treat burns better than she had in 5 years at the academy at the Pectan estate. Yuna kept watch. The creature might return. Yuna slept for 3 hours at a time. She set snares along the approaches. She checked the tracks every morning. On the 5th day, the headman of Solyani Kutori came out to the gate. A man in his 50s with a face carved from stone. He looked at Dan and said one word. "Thank you." Then he fell silent. Then he added that if the boy needed anything, the village would provide it. Dan said he needed 2 volunteers. People who wanted to learn how to dress wounds and prepare herbal decoctions. People who would treat the villagers when he wasn't there. The village head nodded. The next day, 2 people came to see Dan. A young woman and a teenager of about 14. Dan began teaching them. How to clean wounds. How to apply splints. How to make a saline solution for rehydration. How to identify a fracture by swelling and deformity. How to stop bleeding with pressure. Simple things. The basics. Things every Boy Scout knew in his old world. Here, this was secret knowledge. Hannah helped. She explained things better than Dan, more patiently, in greater detail. She had a gift for teaching. Dan noticed this and took it to heart. In 10 days, he would be leaving Solyani Kutori. Behind him, he left 2 students who knew how to apply bandages and brew 3 kinds of herbal decoctions. Not much, but more than nothing. More than there had been yesterday. The system kept track. 7 lives saved in 10 days at Solyani Kutori. Residents. 1 disaster, 1 community. HP 900, MP 410. His strength was such that he could lift an anvil with his left hand. When no one was looking, he tried it. The anvil lifted off the ground like an empty bucket. Dan set it back down. He looked at his hands. The same thin, boyish fingers. The same narrow wrists. No visible change. But beneath the skin lay a strength that had no right to be there. He returned to Kvamakol. Grandfather Yoon stood at the gate as always. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a man in city clothes. A clean cloak. Nice boots. A guild badge on his belt. An auditor. Dan slowed his pace. Yoon, behind him, placed her hand on her bow. Hannah stepped forward slightly. The auditor looked at them. At Dan's gray badge. At Hannah's gold badge. At Yuna's bow. His face was professionally neutral. He introduced himself. He said the guild had sent him to verify reports of healing activities in the abandoned counties. He said that, by law, any healing practice must be licensed by the college. He said that an F-rank healer without a license was in violation of the law. Dan looked at Yuna's grandfather. The old man stood with a stony expression, but his hand was clenched around the handle of an axe. Dan smiled, the most harmless smile he could manage. He said he wasn't a healer. He said he was just gathering herbs. He said that sometimes he helps his neighbors with advice, but you couldn't call that treatment. He said he was only F-rank. What kind of treatment could that be? The auditor looked at him. Then he looked at the village around them, at the sturdy fence, at the people walking upright and looking him in the eye, at the children running down the street, healthy children, in a village that had been written off a year ago. The auditor wasn't a fool. He could see that something wasn't right here, but he couldn't prove it. An F-rank healer is physically incapable of what happened here. The system says HP 40, MP 15. The system doesn't lie. The auditor left the next morning. Dan stood by the gate and watched him go. Yuna stood beside him. She said he'd come back. Dan nodded. He said yes. He'll come back. Or they'll send someone more serious. Hana stood behind them, biting her nail. She knew what the college's attention meant. She'd run away from that attention. Dan turned to both of them. He said they needed to work faster. Deku Mion appeared in Speckled Bend like a storm. Loud, smelling of smoke and iron, broad-shouldered. Her golden braids were tied in a knot at the nape of her neck. Her arms were covered in old burn scars up to her elbows. Her voice was so loud that birds took flight from the rooftops. A C-rank blacksmith. She'd been traveling through the southern counties in search of work, looking for a forge that needed an apprentice. She got stuck because a second wave of the plague had broken out in Speckled Glimmer. Not typhus this time. Throat fever. A childhood illness. 5 people were bedridden. Among them was Deku's youngest sister, Mia, 7 years old, light curls, freckles. Her fever was so high, her lips were cracked and bleeding. Deku had brought her sister here 3 weeks ago to stay with a distant relative while she looked for work. And now... When Dan came by for his regular rounds, Deku was standing in the middle of the village, screaming. She was screaming that she needed a healer, that she would pay, that she would give everything she had. Beck walked up to her and said a healer was on the way. Deku looked at the skinny boy with the grey mark and a basket of herbs walking through the gate. Her expression spoke volumes. She didn't believe him. Dan didn't try to convince her. He walked past her into the house. He found Mia on the bed. He placed his hand on her throat. A diagnostic glance. Her tonsils were swollen to the size of plums. A streptococcal infection, or a local equivalent. Complications affecting her heart had already begun. A rheumatic attack. The mitral valve was leaking. In the old world, that meant penicillin and a month of bed rest. Here, it meant mana and his hands. He worked for 4 hours. First, the throat. He eradicated the infection with a focused stream of mana. The tonsils began to deflate. Then the heart. This was the most delicate procedure he'd ever performed. A valve the size of a fingernail. Inflammation on the valve leaflets, as thin as a hair. He directed his mana like a needle. He reduced microscopic swelling. He restored elasticity to the tissue. Millimeter by millimeter. Hana sat nearby and watched. She saw his mana. She saw the precision of his work. Her eyes were huge. She understood that even the best healers of the college couldn't do this. Not because they weren't capable. Because they didn't know what was needed. Because they didn't know what the mitral valve was. 4 hours later, Mia opened her eyes. She looked up. She saw an unfamiliar face, and she smiled. Just like that. Children know how to smile at strangers when they're feeling good. Dekka was standing in the doorway. She had seen everything. For 4 hours, she stood there watching as an F-rank boy sat over her sister and worked. Without moving. Without getting distracted. 4 hours straight. When Mia smiled, Deku took a step back. She stepped out of the house, leaned against the wall, and cried, quietly, covering her mouth with her hand so no one would hear. A week later, Mia was running around the yard. Her heart was clear, her throat was healthy. Dan checked on her every day. Deku hadn't left his side all week. Not out of affection, out of work. She'd seen his tools. A bone needle, a bronze surgical knife, rusty scissors. She took them without a word. The next day, she brought them back. The needle was made of steel. The knife was sharpened so finely it could slice through a strand of hair in midair. The scissors were new, forged overnight. Dan took the knife and examined the blade. The cutting edge was flawless. He studied the workmanship for a long time. Then he looked at Dekka and said that her hand understood metal. He said he'd seen blacksmiths and that she was better. Dekka turned the color of her own forge. She muttered something unintelligible. She took the old tweezers from him and went to the anvil. 2 hours later, she brought back a new pair of tweezers with such precision that Dan could have removed stitches without looking. Deku stayed. Not because Dan asked her to. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her work and seen craftsmanship. Not a blacksmith's wife. Not a disgrace to her family. A master. Her father had been telling her for 10 years that a woman had no place at the forge. An F-rank boy said more in 10 seconds than her father had in 10 years. She set up a makeshift forge on the edge of Speckled Bend. She began to forge. Tools for Dan. Arrowheads for Yuna. Brackets for shields on the village fence. She ate enough for 3. She laughed in a deep voice. She hugged Mia so tightly that she squealed. She hugged Hannah so tightly that she blushed. She tried to hug Yuna and got an elbow in the ribs. Yuna spent the next half hour trying to hide her smile. The 4 of them. Dan, Yuna, Hana, Daku, and little Mia, who ran between them and thought the world was beautiful. The 5th month. The route of his rounds had expanded. Kvamakal, Speckled Bend, Alder Ravine, Dry River, Salt Farmsteads. 5 villages. Dan went in a circle. A week for a full round. He treated patients. He taught. He tested his students. He adjusted treatment plans. He restocked supplies. Every village knew the day he would arrive. Every village waited. Hana walked with him. She could already treat a burn on her own. Stop the bleeding. Reduce inflammation. Her light worked with pinpoint precision. Like a scalpel, not like a sledgehammer. Yuna walked half a day ahead. She scouted the path. She marked the trees. If a creature from the rift had passed along the trail, Yuna would see it an hour before they reached that spot. Daku stayed in Speckled Bend. She forged. On every round, Dan brought her a list of what was needed. Clamps, hooks, thin steel splints, trays for sterilizing instruments. Things this world had never seen. Dan would sketch them in charcoal on a board, and Deku would look at the drawings, tilting her head. She never asked how he knew what a surgical clamp was supposed to look like. She just forged. By the 6th month, the arc of 5 villages was up and running. People weren't dying of dysentery. They weren't dying of pneumonia. They weren't dying from infected wounds. They were dying from the creatures from the fissures. That was the only thing Dan hadn't been able to fix yet. The fissure near the salt farms was growing. Yuna checked it every week. 2 months ago, a wagon could have passed through it. Now a house could have passed through it. The rank had increased. It went from E to D. The creatures had grown larger, more frequent, more vicious. The village hunters were still managing, but it was a struggle every time. Every time, someone was wounded. Every time, Dan patched them up. He knew this was a race they were losing. You can't keep treating the symptoms forever without addressing the cause. At night, he lay in his shed in Famacol and stared at the ceiling. He thought. His body could do things it couldn't 6 months ago. HP 900, MP 410, strength a healer shouldn't possess. 5 imprints. Tracker, midwife, carpenter, herbalist, hunter. Each one weak, each one a student's skill. But 5 shadows of 5 different people lived within his muscles and remembered things he had never been taught. He rolled onto his side. Behind the shed's wall, a bonfire crackled. Yuna sat by the fire, sharpening arrowheads. Hana was reading her notes by the light of her own magic. Somewhere in Speckled Glade, Deku was hammering away and singing a song that made the neighbors' ears ring. Somewhere in the salt farms, 2 of his apprentices were changing bandages and brewing a decoction according to the instructions he'd left behind. A small world. Fragile. Alive. Dan closed his eyes and thought that in the morning he needed to talk to Grandpa Yoon about the wall around the village. A real wall. Not made of doors and shields, made of logs. Deku would manage. She could handle anything. He fell asleep. And he didn't dream of burning cars. For the first time in 6 months. The creature arrived at dawn. Yuna was the first to see it. She was running toward Huamacol from the rift, her face ashen. She burst through the gate and shouted a single word. Wolfhound. Dan didn't know what a wolfhound was. Grandpa Yoon did. His face went pale. He said it was a C-rank creature. 4 meters at the withers, skin as hard as stone, claws that cut through wood. It had no business being in a D-rank rift. But the rifts are growing, and so are the things crawling out of them. Yoon said the village hunters wouldn't be able to handle it. He said they had to leave. Leave our homes and head north. Dan stood in the middle of the courtyard. People were running around, grabbing their children, gathering their belongings. Panic. He closed his eyes, thought for a moment, opened them, said that no one was going anywhere. Yoon looked at him. Dan said the wall would hold up against the first blow. Said they had time. An hour. Maybe 2. Yoon said that a C-rank creature could break through walls. Dan said he knew. He said he'd hold the wall himself. Yoon opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the gray bar. HP 40, MP 15. That wouldn't be enough to survive a single hit from a C-rank creature. Dan turned to Yoon. He told her to take up a position on the barn roof. Maximum field of view. Aim for the eyes. Only the eyes. He turned to Hana. He told her to stand behind him. If he got wounded, she was to heal him immediately. Shine the light on the wounds. Precisely, just like they'd practiced. Hana turned pale, but nodded. He couldn't heal himself. His profession didn't work on his own body. But Hana could. He walked to the wall, stood by the gate, picked up a log from the ground, 6 meters long, as thick as a man's arm span. He lifted it with one hand. Just lifted it, like a stick. Gripped it with both hands. Laid it across the gate like a bolt. Behind him, there was silence. 20 people watched as an F-rank boy lifted a log that 4 men could barely roll. Grandpa Yoon slowly sat down on the porch. His legs wouldn't hold him. He looked at Dan and couldn't find the words. The ground trembled. The creature was coming. Dan felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. Heavy, rhythmic, 4 paws, each step like a hammer striking the ground. Yoon, on the barn roof, drew the bowstring taut. Her hands didn't tremble. Hana stood 3 steps behind Dan. Her palms glowed. The creature emerged from the forest. 4 meters at the withers. Grandpa Yoon hadn't exaggerated. Its hide was dark gray, rock hard. Its eyes were red. Its mouth was wide open. Its fangs were as long as a forearm. It saw the wall. It saw the people behind it, and it walked forward. It didn't run. It walked. Confidently. Slowly. It knew nothing here threatened it. A C-rank creature in a village without a guild. A bloodbath. Dan stood by the gate. His heart was beating steadily. 60 beats per minute. He checked. A paramedic's habit. Counting a pulse in critical situations. Not his own. Usually someone else's. Now his own. 60. Normal. The creature slammed into the wall. The logs creaked. The wall buckled. It didn't collapse. Deku had built this wall. Deku knew a thing or two about strength. The creature struck a second time. The log bolt at the gate cracked. Dan braced himself against it with his shoulder. The pressure was monstrous. The creature weighed as much as a truck and was charging at full speed. Dan braced himself and held his ground. 900 horsepower, a strength that shouldn't exist. He held the gate against him and didn't budge a step. The creature struck a third time. The log snapped in half. The gate flew apart. The creature burst in and took an arrow to the right eye. From Yuna, from the barn roof, 25 paces, at a moving target. Right in the pupil. The creature howled. It spun around. It slammed its paw against the barn wall. The wall held. Deku had built it, and so had the barn. A second arrow. The left eye. The creature was blind. It roared and smashed everything around it. Blindly. Its paws lashed at the air and the ground. Dan leaped back from the debris of the gate. His body moved quickly, faster than he'd expected. His tracker's instinct gave him a sense of the creature's movements. He could see where it would strike a second before the blow, by the tension in its muscles, by the twist of its body. His diagnostic gaze worked on monsters, too. The creature struck with its paw where he had been standing a moment ago. Its claws tore up the ground half a meter deep. Dan found himself to the side. The creature swiped its tail. The bony spike at the end whizzed past his face, just a centimeter away. He felt the wind. Yuna's third arrow struck the creature's neck. It didn't pierce the hide. It was made of stone, but it distracted it. The creature turned toward the barn. Though blind, it sensed Yuna by her scent. Dan picked up a splinter of log from the ground, a 2-meter-long piece of oak as thick as a thigh. He gripped it with both hands and struck the creature's front paw, with all his might, a strength an F-rank healer shouldn't possess. Bone cracked. The creature collapsed onto its left side. The ground shook. Yuna didn't miss a beat. The fourth arrow, into its open maw, through the roof of its mouth, straight into the brain. The creature twitched. Its paws scraped against the ground. It froze. Silence. Dan stood over the carcass, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He turned and saw the entire village standing behind him. 20 people. Grandfather Young-Gisop, the hunters' wives, children, everyone. They were staring at the dead creature, at the splinter of log in the boy's hands, at the gray F-rank mark that flickered quietly above his head as if to mock him. Dan tossed the log aside. He turned to Grandfather Yun. He said he needed to check if anyone was injured. Yun looked at him. Then he nodded. No one was injured. Dan exhaled. Then he walked quietly over to the well. He peered into the water. For the first time since he'd arrived in this world, he saw his reflection. A gaunt face, dark eyes, teenage features. A gray mark hung above the reflection. But with his own eyes, he saw something else. The diagnostic gaze worked only as a reflection. In the well's water, he saw his real stats. HP 920, MP 430, Strength 187, Agility 94, Stamina 203, Rank undefined. He stared for a long time. Then he laughed, quietly, alone, above the well. He laughed because the numbers were absurd. Because 6 months ago he had stood in a marble hall with HP 40 glowing above his head. Because every single point represented someone's life. A girl with pneumonia, a hunter with an abscess, a boy with seizures, a fishmonger. Every +1 is a person who's breathing. He stopped laughing. He straightened up. He went to help fix the gate. Yuna jumped down from the barn roof. She walked over to him. She didn't say a word. She stood beside him and began gathering the debris. Hannah stood to the side. Her hands were still glowing. She looked at Dan, and there was something new in her eyes. Not admiration, not fear, understanding. She was beginning to understand who he really was. Not an F-rank healer, not an orphaned boy. Something else. Something for which there was no name in the college's textbooks. After the fight with Volkodov, Grandpa Yoon Gasup stopped calling Dan a kid. He started calling him son. It happened quietly. No announcements. Just the next morning, the old man said over breakfast that his son needed to eat more after what had happened yesterday. Dan looked at him. Yoon looked away. He chewed his bread. He didn't explain anything. There was no need. A week after the fight, Dan was repairing a wall, a gate, a barn. He worked with his hands. The carpenter's touch guided his fingers across the wood. He knew how to lay logs, how to cut grooves, how to set rafters. Someone else's knowledge lived in his muscles and worked for him. Decca came from Spotted Ben when she heard about the attack. She came running. She brought a bag of nails and a bundle of steel staples with her. She saw the broken gate and silently began forging new hinges right there on the spot. She set up her portable forge against the wall and hammered away until nightfall. By morning, the gate was standing, stronger than before, steel staples at every joint. Deku wiped her forehead and said that a C-rank beast would be gnawing at these gates until lunchtime. Then she looked at Dan, then at his hands, then at the splinter of log he'd used to break Volkodov's paw. She didn't ask anything. She just nodded to herself and went to sleep. 10 days after the battle, Ellie arrived in Hvamakal. Allison Caro, 22 years old, an A-rank scout. She didn't come with good intentions. She came on a contract. Duke Karen had hired her to track down a strange F-rank boy whom the auditor had reported on. The auditor's report had been cautious. No accusations. Just questions. The village that had been written off was still standing. The children were healthy, the hunters were unharmed. An unlicensed F-rank healer was doing something. What exactly was unclear. The system showed HP 40. Karan read the report and hired Ellie. Don't kill. Observe. 1 month. Report back. Ellie was a professional. An A-rank scout is a shadow among shadows. She could follow a person for weeks and they wouldn't even notice. She set up camp in the forest, an hour's walk from Hvamakal. She began her surveillance. The first week. She saw Dan get up before dawn, how he made his rounds through the village, how he checked on the sick, how he treated an old woman with a bad back, how he taught Hana to direct light, how he talked with Grandfather Yoon, how he sat by the campfire in the evening and drew something resembling a diagram of the human body with charcoal on a board. Nothing suspicious. An F-rank healer doing what he could. Not much, not well, but he was trying. The second week. Ellie followed him on his rounds. Hvamakal, Speckled Bend, Alder Ravine. She saw him lancing a farmer's abscess, washing a boy's wound, sitting for 4 hours over a woman with a fever, not moving. She saw his hands, precise, quick, confident. Not the hands of a boy. The hands of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. It made her wary, but it didn't prove anything. Third week. She saw a battle. Not a new one. The aftermath of an old one. Volkodov's carcass hadn't been burned yet. Ellie examined it, professionally. An A-rank scout knows how to read the signs of a fight. She saw Yuna's arrows, 4 of them. Excellent work. A D-rank tracker shoots like a B-rank. She saw Volkodov's broken front paw. A bone as thick as a man's arm. A fracture from a single blow. She found a splinter of a log. She looked at it. She looked at the carcass. Then she sat crouched for a long time, smoking her pipe. A C-rank beast. The bone was broken with a single blow. An F-rank healer with 40 HP. The math didn't add up. The fourth week. She watched as Dan lifted a log for a new section of the wall, with one hand. The log weighed 200 kilograms. Ellie took out her pipe, lit it, smoked it down to the end. Then she took out her notebook, wrote a report. The subject is an ordinary young man, no threat. I recommend terminating surveillance. She closed her notebook, looked at him. She looked at the village where children were running down the street and laughing. She looked at her hands, hands that had been killing for money for 10 years, hands that had left the wounded to die because it wasn't profitable to save them. She had torn up her contract with Karan. It had cost her her reputation. A mercenary who tears up a contract is as good as dead in this line of work. She didn't care. She emerged from the forest the next morning and headed for the gates of Hvamakal. Yuna spotted her 200 paces away. Her bow was drawn. An arrow sat on the string. Yuna could sense strangers from a kilometer away. She could sense an A-rank scout from 2 kilometers away. Ellie raised her hands. She signaled that she was unarmed. Yuna didn't lower her bow. Dan stepped out of the house. He looked at Ellie. Tall, muscular, short, dark hair, a scar on her chin, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. A golden plaque glinted above her head. A-rank scout. Dan blinked. A-rank? Enrollment. Ellie looked at his gray mark. She smiled. She said she needed a job. She said she was a good scout. She said she could protect him and his villages. Dan asked why she wanted to do that. Ellie paused. Then she said she was tired of watching people die. Dan looked into her eyes. 10 seconds. 20. His diagnostic gaze wasn't just for illnesses. He saw fatigue in her muscles, chronic sleep deprivation, an old injury to her right shoulder, scar tissue on her ribs, and something else, an early-stage stomach ulcer, stress, years of stress. He told her she had an ulcer and that he needed to examine her. Ellie blinked. Then she laughed, hoarsely, briefly. She said they'd hired him to watch her, not the other way around. Then she fell silent. Then she said they'd accepted her. Dan nodded. Yuna lowered her bow. She didn't put it away, she just lowered it. Ellie walked into the village. That evening, Dan treated her ulcer, his hands on her stomach, mana flowing in a steady stream. Ellie lay on a bench and stared at the ceiling. She was silent. Dan told her she needed to quit smoking. Ellie told him to go to hell. Dan said the ulcer would come back. Ellie said she knew. Dan said that in that case, he'd heal her again. Ellie fell silent, for a long time. Then she quietly said one word. Thank you. The 5 of them. Dan, Yuna, Hana, Daku, Ellie. A team. Not an army, not a guild, not a squad. Just people who stood together because standing together was the right thing to do. Ellie brought some information with her. She told Dan that Karan wouldn't let it go, that the auditor had reported some irregularities, that Karan had hired her to keep an eye on things, but if he didn't get a report, he'd send someone else, someone more serious. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he asked how much time they had. Ellie said a month, maybe 2. Dan said that was enough. Ellie asked what for. Dan said so he could become too useful to be quietly taken out. Ellie looked at him. Then she smirked. She said he wasn't half bad at figuring things out for a kid. Dan wasn't offended. He was thinking about something else, about the rift that was growing, about the villages that depended on him, about the college that was following him, and about the secret hidden somewhere at the bottom of his profession. Every time he healed someone, the system gave him numbers, HP, MP, strength. But there was something else, something he felt but couldn't name. As if every healing left a mark, not only on his body, but also on something greater, something beneath the surface of the world. He didn't understand it yet, but he felt it, and that feeling was growing. Winter came early. The first snow fell at the beginning of the 10th month. White. Heavy. It buried the trails. It blocked the roads. It cut the villages off from one another. Dan stood on the threshold of his house in Kvamokol. Yes, home. The village had built him a house. Not a big one. 2 rooms, a stove, a sturdy roof. Grandfather Yoon said that a shed was no place for a person. Dan didn't argue. He stood on the threshold and looked at the snow. He thought about the salt farms, about Alder Ravine, about Speckled Bend. Making the winter detour meant a 3-day trek knee-deep in snowdrifts. He couldn't stop. People got sick more often in winter. Colds, frostbite, hunger. Hunger because supplies ran out faster when the road was blocked and merchants couldn't travel. Dan distributed the supplies, to each village according to the list. Herbs, tinctures, bandages, instructions for the students, what to do in case of frostbite, how to recognize pneumonia, when to call him. Ellie proved to be indispensable. An A-rank scout sees what others don't. She covered all 5 villages in 2 days. She mapped out the winter trails. She found shortcuts through the forest that weren't covered by snow. She marked dangerous areas where creatures might roam. Yuna walked with her. The 2 hunters walked silently through the forest, understanding each other without words. Yuna was a tracker by instinct, Ellie by experience. Together, they secured the perimeter of the arc formed by the 5 villages better than a guild outpost ever could. Hana stayed in Wamakal. She was treating patients, on her own, without Dan, for the first time. An old man with chronic bronchitis. She directed light into his lungs. Precisely. She reduced the inflammation. She loosened the phlegm. The old man coughed it up for the first time in a week. Hana stood over him, her hands trembling. Not from fatigue, from joy. She was truly healing. Not the gilded pretense of the college. For real. That evening, she went to see Dan and told him about it. Her eyes were ablaze. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he said she'd done a great job. Hana fell silent. She turned away. Dan didn't see her press her palms against her cheeks, her burning cheeks. She worked non-stop. Winter is a time for stockpiling for a blacksmith. She was forging arrowheads for Yuna, door bolts, wall staples, shutter hinges, knives for every home, and medical instruments. The list grew every week. Dan drew. Daku forged. A syringe without a needle. A dilator. Spring-loaded clamps. A retractor. Things this world had never known. Deku looked at the blueprints and shook her head. Then she forged. Each tool turned out better than the last. Her hands learned with every piece she made. Her craft gave her an inexplicable intuition for metal. She simply knew what heat was needed, how long to hold it, when to strike, when to let go. In the middle of winter, what Dan had feared happened. The rift near the salt farm spat out a pack. Not just one creature, 12. Small ones, wolves with red eyes, rank E each. But 12 is 12. They came at night. Ellie spotted them by their tracks an hour before the attack. She woke Dan. Dan woke Yuna. Yuna got up and grabbed her bow. The three of them went out. Dan, Yuna, and Ellie. Hana stayed in the village. If anyone got hurt, she had to be there. A battle in the winter forest. Snow up to their knees. Darkness. Red eyes glinting between the trees. Yuna shot from behind a tree. Arrow after arrow. Every one hit its mark. 5 creatures fell in the first minute. Ellie moved like smoke. An A-rank scout in battle is a different kind of creature. She didn't fight. She vanished and reappeared. 2 short blades. A strike. A creature falls. Another strike. 1 more. 3 in half a minute. The 4 remaining creatures lunged at Dan. He stood in the center of the clearing. Exposed. Unarmed. They leaped. Dan stepped aside. The first creature flew past. He grabbed the second one by the scruff of the neck. With his bare hand, he flung it at the third. Both rolled across the snow. The fourth clamped onto his forearm. Its fangs pierced through his cloak. Through his skin. Pain. Real pain. Dan clenched his teeth. He grabbed the creature by the jaw. He pried it open. He threw it aside. 4 deep fang marks on his forearm. Blood on the snow. He couldn't heal himself. His body was the only one to which the profession was indifferent. Yuna took out the 2 remaining ones with arrows. Ellie finished off the ones he'd thrown. 12 creatures. 3 minutes. Yuna ran up to him. She saw the blood. Her face went pale. Dan said it was just a scratch. Yuna said he was lying. Dan smirked. Hana met them at the gate. She saw his arm. She turned pale. Then she pulled herself together. She sat him down. She shone the light on the wounds. Precisely. Just as he'd taught her. The tissue closed up. The bleeding stopped. The pain went away. 10 minutes later, only pink scars remained from the wounds. Hana finished, and her hands were shaking. She said he was an idiot. He said you shouldn't go out without a weapon. Dan said nothing. He couldn't explain to her that his hands were his weapon, that every imprint, every +1 to his strength, every month of treatment had turned his body into something it had no right to be. A weapon disguised as a tool. 3 days after the fight in the forest, news came from Sukaya Rechka. A child was seriously ill. A 7-year-old boy. Seizures. Loss of consciousness. The student Dan had left behind in the village couldn't handle it. Dan was ready in a minute. Yuna by his side. Hana by his side. A 3-day journey through the winter forest. They walked quickly. Ellie went ahead to clear a path. When they arrived, the boy was lying unconscious. His temperature was over 40. Seizures every hour. The mother sat beside him, motionless. She wasn't crying anymore. She was beyond tears. Dan placed his hand on the child's head. A diagnostic glance. Meningitis. Inflammation of the brain's membranes. In the old world, intravenous antibiotics and intensive care. Here, it was his hands and mana. He worked for 6 hours, without a break. Mana flowed from him into the inflamed tissue surrounding the brain. Precision work. A millimeter's error and the brain would be damaged. Hana sat beside him. When his mana ran out, she would place her hand on his shoulder and give him hers. They worked like 2 surgeons at the same operating table, without words. A gesture, a glance, a nod. That was enough. At 5 o'clock, the boy opened his eyes. He looked at Dan, at Hana. His eyes were clear. His temperature had dropped. The seizures had stopped. His mother let out a sound. Not a scream, not a moan. The sound a person makes when the ground slips away from under their feet and then returns. Dan checked his reflexes, pupils, reaction to light, coordination. Everything was normal. No brain damage. He stood up. He staggered. Hannah caught him. He leaned on her. She was warm. He was cold, frozen to the last drop of mana. The boy's mother was kneeling in front of them. Dan told her to stand up. He told her the boy would be fine. He said he'd need another week of rest and warm drinks. The mother stood up. She hugged him, tightly, until it cracked. He let her. HP ticked up. MP ticked up. Resonance doubled it. He didn't count. On the way back, Hana walked beside him, closer than usual. Yuna walked behind them. Closer, too. Ellie was waiting for them halfway there. She looked at Dan. He was ashen with exhaustion. Ellie silently offered her shoulder. Dan leaned on it. She carried him the last kilometer. She laid him on the bed in his house in Huamacal. She covered him with a blanket. She threw some firewood into the stove. She went outside. She sat down on the porch. She took out her pipe. She didn't light it. She looked at the pipe. Then at the door behind which slept the boy she was supposed to hand over to the Duke. She put the pipe in her pocket. She sighed. Snow was falling over Huamacal. Quiet. Heavy. Winter was past its midpoint, and the arc of 5 villages stood firm. People lived. Children did not die. Hunters returned on their own 2 feet, and rumors crept, slowly, unstoppably, northward, toward the capital, to the ears of those who would be better off not hearing them. Duke Yun Karan arrived in early spring. He wasn't alone. With him were 4 horsemen in the uniforms of the Healers' College, white cloaks, silver clasps, and rank insignia no lower than B on each. An entourage, a security detail, a display of power. Dan found out about this 3 hours before their arrival. Ellie spotted the group on the northern road and came running. Dan was standing in the middle of the courtyard, teaching Hana how to apply a pressure bandage to a thigh. A straw mannequin, strips of cloth. Hana worked quickly. Her fingers were precise, knot after knot. She'd learned. Dan looked up at Ellie. Ellie said, 5 horsemen, the council, the Duke himself. Dan was silent for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. He said they needed to remove the medical instruments from the house. Everything Daku had forged. Syringes, clamps, retractors, stretcher. Things that shouldn't exist in this world. Hana tossed aside the bandage and ran into the house. Yuna, without a word, began gathering the instruments into a bag. Ellie took the bag and disappeared into the forest. An A-rank scout hides things so that no one can find them. Deku was in Speckled Glade. Good. Her portable forge and anvil might have raised questions. 3 hours later, Duke Karan rode into Huamacal. Dan was standing by his house. Grandfather Yun Gisop was nearby. Han was behind him. Yun was on the roof of the granary, not with a bow. She was just sitting there, watching. Ellie was nowhere to be seen. She was everywhere. Karan dismounted. Tall. Gray-haired. 60 years old, but standing straight. A noble face. His eyes were intelligent. Cold. Above his head hung a golden plaque. A-rank Mage of Light. Head of the Healers' College. His face was on the coins. Patron of orphans. A man whose power rested on a monopoly over expensive, useless healing. He looked out over the village. At the sturdy walls. At the healthy children. At the smooth roads between the houses. At the faces of the people who looked him in the eye. They didn't hide. They didn't bow. They looked. Karan looked at Dan. At the gray badge. F rank. HP 40. MP 15. Karan smiled. The smile was warm. Fatherly. Professional. He walked over and said he was glad to finally meet him. He said he'd heard many good things about the young healer who helps people in distant counties. He said the college appreciates such dedication to the cause. Dan bowed. Politely. Modestly. He said he simply gathered herbs and sometimes helped his neighbors. Karan nodded. He said he'd like to see how the young man worked, if that was all right. Dan said, "Of course." He led him through the village. He showed him the garden with medicinal herbs. He showed him the drying shed where bundles of yarrow and chamomile hung. He showed him his house. 2 rooms, a stove, a shelf with clay pots for decoctions. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would give him away. Karan walked around and looked. His men walked around and looked. One of them approached Grandpa Yoon and started asking questions. Yoon answered briefly. Yes, the boy lives here. Yes, he helps out. He gathers herbs. He applies compresses. Nothing special. Just a regular F rank, Yoon lied calmly. The old man, who had been a D-rank hunter for 30 years, knew how to keep a straight face better than some aristocrats. Karan asked Dan to demonstrate how he treated patients. Dan nodded. He led him to the old man with a sore back. He laid his hands on him. He channeled his mana, a thin stream, weak, deliberately weak. He spent 15 units of mana, exactly as much as an F-rank healer should have. He eased the spasm. He reduced the superficial inflammation. The old man felt a little better. Not by much. Just enough for an F-rank healer to help. Karan stood and watched. His expression didn't change. But Dan saw his eyes. Karan wasn't a fool. Karan was an A-rank light mage. He could sense mana. He could see Dan's flow. And he could see that the flow was steady, controlled, precise. Too precise for an F-rank. F-rank healers pour mana like water from a bucket, formless, directionless. This boy directed his mana the way a surgeon guides a scalpel. Karan said nothing. He smiled. He thanked him. That evening, Karan invited Dan to dinner. His men had pitched a tent just outside the village. A table, wine, candles, silverware. Karan sat across from Dan and looked at him through the candlelight. Then he spoke. He said he saw talent in the young man. He said an F-rank was unfair. He said the college could help. There was a place at court, a laboratory, a title, a salary, training under the best masters, everything the young man could possibly want. Dan listened. His face was calm. Inside, he was weighing his options. A position at court was a cage. A laboratory was control. A title was a leash. Karan wasn't offering help. Karan was offering to buy him. Dan said he was grateful. He said he liked it here. He said the people in the distant villages needed him more than the court did. Karan didn't stop smiling, but his eyes had changed. They had grown harder. He said he understood. He said that youth was idealistic, and that was wonderful. Then he said that practicing without a license from the college was a violation of the law. He said that, of course, he'd turn a blind eye to it if the young man changed his mind. Dan understood. It wasn't a gift. It was a warning. Come to the court, or we'll shut you down. Dan politely thanked him for dinner. He stepped out of the tent. Hannah was waiting outside. She'd heard everything. The tent walls were thin. She stood there, pale, clenching her fists. She knew Karan. She had run away from him. This man was supposed to be her husband. She whispered that Karan wouldn't back down. Dan nodded. He said he knew. Yuna stood in the shadow of the fence. Ellie was on the roof of the house across the street. Both of them had heard. Both remained silent. Karan left at dawn. His entourage took down the tent and rode off to the north. Yuna's grandfather stepped out onto the porch and watched the dust trail on the road. He spat. He said one word. Wolf. Dan stood beside him. He nodded. Karan was a wolf. Clever, patient, dangerous. He hadn't come to make an offer. He'd come to assess the threat. And he'd assessed it. He sensed that the boy was stronger than he let on. But the system said F-rank. The system didn't lie. Or it lied so well that even an A-rank mage couldn't detect the deception. Karan left in a rage. A quiet one. Controlled. The fury of a man accustomed to a world that obeyed his rules, who suddenly saw something that didn't fit those rules. A week after Karan's departure, a traveler arrived in Huamakol. An old man. Thin. Wearing a black cloak. He asked for water and a place to stay for the night. Grandfather Yun let him in. That evening, the traveler sat down next to Dan by the campfire. He spoke. Quietly. Cautiously. He said he'd heard of a young healer. He said he belonged to the Order of Silent Mercy. He said the order believed in the true healer, who would come and sacrifice himself to resurrect an ancient god. He said they had been searching for him for 3 centuries. Dan listened. His face was impassive. Inside, he felt cold. The stranger said they were not enemies, that they wanted to help, that they possessed knowledge of the true nature of the healer's profession, knowledge that no longer existed anywhere else. Dan asked what kind of knowledge. The stranger smiled. He said this wasn't a conversation for by the campfire. He said that if the young man was interested, the order would wait. He left at dawn. Ellie followed him to the forest. He vanished. He didn't just leave. He vanished. An A-rank scout lost his trail. Ellie returned, looking gloomy. She said that this man was at least S-rank, or something that had no rank at all. Dan sat by the extinguished campfire. He thought. The Duke wanted to buy him. The Order wanted to use him. Both saw him as a tool. Neither saw him as a person. He stood up. He walked toward the house. On the way, he stopped at the house where a family lived with a boy he'd cured of parasites 3 months ago. The boy was running around the yard, healthy and cheerful. He saw Dan, ran up to him, grabbed his hand, and dragged him over to show him a beetle he'd found under a rock. Dan let himself be dragged along. He looked at the beetle. He said it was beautiful. The boy beamed. Dan walked on. His HP beeped. No, not from the boy, from himself. A reminder. Why was he here? Not for stats, not for power, for the boys who run around the yard and show him beetles. Spring brought both life and death at the same time. The fissure near the salt farms had grown again. It had gone from D rank to C rank. Yuna checked it every week. She'd return from the forest with her lips tightly pressed together and silently show the notches on her stick, the size of the opening. Every week, it grew by the width of a palm. There were more creatures, more often, more varied. Not just wolves and goblins, lizards had appeared, armored ones, dumb but resilient. Spiders the size of a calf had appeared, venomous. One bite, and without an antidote, a day of agony. The hunters were holding their own, for now. But every battle cost them wounds. Every wound cost Dan mana. The race continued. A girl arrived in Solyanya Kuturi, alone, on foot, from a village called Kameni Porog. Dan had never heard of it. The village lay even farther to the southeast, beyond the rift. The girl was 15 years old, thin, as slender as a reed. Her clothes were in tatters. Her eyes were huge, empty. She had walked barefoot across the still frozen ground, and her feet were blue. The village headman of Solyanya Kuturi brought her to Dan. Dan looked at her, and his heart sank. He had seen eyes like that in a past life, the eyes of people who had endured what they should never have had to endure. He knelt down in front of her. He told her his name was Dan. He asked her name. She was silent, for a long time. Then she whispered, Sora. Sora Kim. Dan said she needed to warm up. He led her into the house. He wrapped her in a blanket. Hana brought hot broth. Sora drank it in small sips. Her hands were shaking. Dan didn't ask what had happened. He didn't press her. He waited. 2 hours later, Sora spoke on her own, quietly, almost in a whisper. Stone Threshold has been destroyed. A creature from the rift. A big one. It came at night. It tore down houses. It killed people. Sora was hiding in the cellar. She heard screams. She heard her mother scream. Then silence. In the morning she came out. The village was gone. No people. She walked for 3 days, without food, without water, through the forest, past the rift. She didn't know where she was going. She just kept walking, because she couldn't stand still. Dan listened. He didn't move. When she fell silent, he asked one question. He asked if she had awakened. Sora looked up. A pale gray mark flickered above her head. Healer, F rank, HP 35, MP 12. Dan stared at that mark. The same one. That very one. The same gray inscription he'd seen in the marble hall a year ago. The same profession that the entire temple had laughed at him for. Sora said she'd awakened a month ago. There was no temple of the first spark in the village. She'd awakened on her own. It happens. Rarely. Usually it happens to those chosen by the system itself. Sora said that when she saw the inscription above her head, she started crying. F-rank healer. The most useless profession. She couldn't save her mother. She couldn't save anyone. She decided the gods had cursed her. Dan was silent. 10 seconds. 20. Then he sat down next to her. Not across from her, next to her, shoulder to shoulder. A little girl and a boy who looked only slightly older. He said 3 words to her. See what she can do. He raised his hand, placed his palm on the table, activated diagnostic vision. The wood of the table came into view before him. He could see the fibers, the growth rings, the knots, old cracks. He told Sora to place her hand next to his. Sora did. Her hand was trembling. Dan told her to close her eyes and feel the table. Sora closed them. Nothing. Dan didn't rush her. He told her to breathe. 1, 2. 1, 2. Sora breathed. In the 3rd minute, her fingers twitched. Her eyes flew open. She pulled her hand away, pressed it to her chest, looked at Dan, whispered what she'd seen. She'd seen the tree. From the inside. Its ailments. A bug gnawing at the heartwood. A crack from the frost. Dan nodded. He said this was only the beginning. He said their profession wasn't trashy. He said she was stronger than the whole world thought. He said he'd show her everything. Sora's hands were trembling, not from the cold, from excitement, from the first emotion in 3 weeks that wasn't terror. Dan took on his first student. Sora stayed by his side, small, quiet, afraid of loud noises. She flinched at the knock on the door. She spoke in a whisper. She didn't sleep at night. Dan didn't treat her fears. He gave her work to do. Every morning, Sora went on rounds with him. She carried a box of herbs. She handed him his tools. She watched him treat patients. She listened as he explained. The diagnostic gaze, the precise flow of mana, where the liver is located, how the kidneys function, why a cough can be a sign of a diseased heart. Sora absorbed it all, quickly, eagerly. Her memory was sharp. Her hands learned in days, not weeks. 2 weeks later, she independently diagnosed an ear infection in a child. A month later, she cleared up the infection with mana, weak, as thin as a thread, but directed precisely. Dan stood nearby and watched. She had done it. He told her she'd done well. Sora didn't answer. She stood over the child and cried, quietly, silently, because this child was the first person she had ever saved, the first proof that the gods hadn't cursed her. Spring was coming. The arc of villages was growing. 3 more had been added to the original 5, refugees from distant settlements, people who had heard that there was a healer in the south who didn't charge money. They came. They stayed. They built houses nearby. Deku forged nails and staples. Yuna marked out new sections of the fence. Ellie patrolled the perimeter. Hana treated minor cases herself. Sora helped her. 2 healers, a B-rank light mage and an F-rank healer. The college's official doctrine stated that the former could do everything and the latter nothing. Reality proved otherwise. Hana healed better than any college graduate. After 2 months, Sora could diagnose with greater accuracy than mages twice her age. Both had studied under the boy with the gray mark. Both knew what no one else in the kingdom knew: anatomy, physiology, and the principles of infection and immunity. The terms were different. Dan didn't say the word bacteria. He said tiny creatures that live in dirt and get into wounds. He didn't say antiseptic. He said a tincture that kills tiny creatures. The essence was the same. In his past world, this knowledge had been accumulated over 300 years. Here, he passed it on over the course of months. By early summer, the arc of villages numbered 8 settlements. The population had doubled. People were coming. Dan stood on the hill near Kavamakol and looked south. Somewhere out there, the rift pulsed. C-rank. Growing. Waiting. He could feel it. Not with his eyes, with something else. That very same feeling that grew within him with every person he healed. Each healing left a mark not only on his body. Each healing was a stitch. He didn't yet know what it was on, but he could feel the thread, and the thread led to the rift. Irene Walker stood in the Speckled Bend market and watched as Dan saved a child, a 4-year-old boy. He'd choked on a bone. His face was blue. His mother was screaming. Dan walked over. He stood behind the child. He wrapped his arms around him, a fist under the ribs, a push upward, a second one, a third. The bone flew out. The boy coughed. He cried. He began to breathe. 30 seconds. From a blue face to a cry of life, 30 seconds. The mother fell to her knees. Irene stood to the side, unable to move. She saw what no one else saw. Her profession, a B-rank necromancer. The magic of the boundary between life and death. She saw the threads of life of every living creature. Thin, glowing, trembling. The boy's thread, a second before Dan's push, was almost transparent. It was fading, dissolving. His soul had already half separated from his body. And then Dan touched him, and the thread flared up, brightly, almost blindingly. The soul jerked back, not because of the shove, not because the bone had flown out, because of Dan's touch. His hands were pulling life back into the body, like a magnet pulls iron. Irene watched, holding her breath. In her 24 years of life, she had seen thousands of deaths. She had seen threads snap. She had seen souls depart. She knew how to hold a soul back for a few minutes, to hold the thread, to slow the departure. But she had never seen anyone pull a soul back. Not with magic, not with a spell, with his hands, with a simple touch. She waited until evening. She found Dan. He was sitting by the well, washing his hands after his rounds. She walked over and stood before him, slender, pale, a black cloak, black hair down to her waist, eyes dark and deep like two wells. Above his head hung a golden plaque, B-rank necromancer. Dan looked up. He looked at the plaque. He looked at her. Irene said she'd seen what he'd done. She said his hands had restored the child's soul. Dan was silent for a moment. He said he'd simply pulled a bone out of the child's throat. Irene shook her head. She said she could see the threads of life. She said the boy's thread was already snapping. She said his hands had sewn it back together. Dan froze. Sewn. That word. He'd heard it inside himself before, every time he healed someone and felt that strange response, as if something beneath the surface of the world was reacting to his work. Stitching. He asked Irene what she knew about the healer's profession. Irene answered briefly. Trash. Weak. Useless. Just like her own. Everyone hated necromancers. A dead person. A vulture. The one who waits for the dead. She'd been banished from her own country. She'd been wandering for 2 years. Alone. Her magic allowed her to see when someone was about to die. She saw it in the eyes of passers-by, at markets, in villages, constantly. Death was everywhere, and no one asked her for help, because who needs a necromancer? Dan listened. Then he told her one thing. He said that in 2 days he was going to Solyanye Kutori. There, a woman was dying from blood loss after a difficult childbirth. He said he might need someone to hold her back if he didn't make it in time. 5 minutes. That would be enough. Irene looked at him. For a long time. He didn't ask her to join him. He didn't offer her a job. He didn't promise anything. He said he needed help. Her help. Her magic. The very thing everyone turned away from. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. The first ones in 15 years. She said yes. 2 days later, they were on their way to Solyanye Kutere. Dan, Yuna, Hana, Sora, Irene. The woman who was bleeding was in critical condition. The delivery had gone smoothly. The baby was healthy, but the placenta hadn't detached, and she'd started bleeding. Heavily. Rapidly. The local midwife had done everything she could. The rest was up to Dan. He entered the house. He placed his hands on the woman's abdomen. Diagnostic gaze. The uterus. The placenta was adhered to the wall. 3 attachment points. Bleeding. The woman's HP was dropping before his eyes. Dan got to work. He separated the placenta with mana. Precisely. Fiber by fiber, simultaneously cauterizing the blood vessels that opened up. Delicate work. He was pushing the limits of control. Hana stood nearby. Her light illuminated the surgical field, not for Dan's eyes, but for his mana. Hana's light enhanced the precision of his diagnostic gaze. They discovered this by accident 3 weeks ago. Together, their abilities worked better than they did separately. 20 minutes in, the woman began to slip away. Dan could feel it. Her pulse was weakening. Her breathing was shallow. He wasn't going to make it in time. Another 5 minutes of work, but she didn't have 5 minutes left. He turned to Irene. She was standing by the door, pale, tense. She could see the woman's thread of life, thin, fading, ready to snap. Dan told her to hold on. 5 minutes. Irene stepped forward. She placed her hand on the woman's forehead. She closed her eyes. Her magic unfolded. Dark, silent, not healing, ideally. She seized the thread of life and held it. She didn't pull it back. She held it. She wouldn't let it go. The woman froze between life and death. Her pulse was weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow but even. Time stood still for her. Dan was working. 5 minutes. The last attachment point. He severed it. He cauterized it. The bleeding stopped. The uterus contracted. He channeled mana to regenerate the blood. A lot. All he had. Hana added her own. The woman shuddered. Her eyes opened. The thread of life in Irene's hands flared and grew stronger. Irene let go. She stepped back. Her legs buckled. Sora caught her. The little 15-year-old girl held the adult woman like a child and wouldn't let go. Dan checked her pulse. Steady. Her breathing was even. Her complexion was turning rosy. She'd live. He turned to Irene. She was sitting on the floor. Sora was beside her. Irene was looking at her hands, the hands that had been called cursed her whole life, the hands that had just saved a life. Dan thanked her, simply, without fanfare. Thank you. Irene pressed her lips together. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice. That evening, by the campfire, Irene shared something. She explained that her magic allowed her to see not only people's threads, she could see the threads of the world. Thin lines that hold reality together. And near the rifts, these lines are torn. A rift is a hole in the fabric of the world, and every time Dan heals a person near a rift, the threads of the world tighten just a little, microscopically, imperceptible to everyone but her. Dan sat in silence. The threads of the world, mending. Every person saved is a stitch, not just on their body, on the fabric of the world. Irene said that in the old books she'd read in her country's library before her exile, the healer's profession had a different name. Not healer, stitcher. Dan repeated the word. Stitcher. It clicked into place like a key in a lock. Irene said that 300 years ago, someone changed the profession. They stripped it down. They removed its main function, the ability to mend not only people, but also the world. They turned the stitcher into a mere shadow of its former self, a trash healer. And they wrote in the temple records that it had always been that way. Dan asked who. Irene shook her head. She didn't know. But she knew that this person was still alive. 300 years. Ordinary people don't live that long. But whoever opened the vaults must have found a way. Dan stared into the fire. 6 of them sat around the campfire. Dan, Yuna, Hannah, Daku, Sora, Irene. Ellie stood in the darkness beyond the perimeter, listening. 7. 7 people against the one who shattered the world. Dan raised his head. He looked up at the stars. Somewhere to the south, the rift pulsed. He could feel it clearly now. Ragged edges, torn threads, a hole in the fabric of reality. And inside that hole, something was waiting. Something old. Something hungry. He said quietly that it was time for them to go there. Yuna looked up. Hannah looked up. Everyone looked up. Dan said that the rift was near the C-rank salt farms. He said that the army had abandoned him. The guilds had abandoned him. He said that if they didn't seal it, in a year it would become a B rank, then an A. Then whatever it became would devour everything they'd built. Ellie stepped out of the darkness. She said he was crazy. Then she sat down by the fire and said she was with him. They spent 2 weeks preparing. Dan drew up a plan, not a combat plan, but a medical one, the kind a paramedic uses to prepare a team for a mass casualty incident. Roles, positions, procedures for treating injuries to each team member, contingency plans, retreat routes. Yuna scouted the approaches to the rift. 3 trails, the main one, the alternate, the emergency route. She set up markers. She booby-trapped the narrow passages. Ellie conducted a full reconnaissance. 2 days in the forest around the rift. She counted the creatures, 17 within sight. Among them, 1 large one, very large, the size of a house, armored, 6 legs, 2 spiked tails. Ellie named it Thunderbreaker. She said this creature is at least upper C rank, maybe lower B. She said that if it makes it to the villages, nothing will stop it. Daku forged new arrowheads for Yuna. Steel, armor-piercing, as narrow as an awl. Against armored creatures, a regular tip is useless. You need one that can pierce the gap between the plates. Dekka forged them for 3 days. She tested each one personally. She drove them into an oak die from 10 paces away. If it went in whole, it was good. If not, she remade it. Hana trained, 3 hours every morning. A beam of light focused on a spot the size of a pinhead, 15 paces away. She learned to blind them. 1 flash in the creature's eyes, and it goes blind for 30 seconds. 30 seconds in battle is an eternity. Sora prepared first aid kits, bandages, ties, tinctures, ointments, splints. A personal kit for each team member. A double set for Dan because he couldn't treat himself. Irene remained silent and prepared in her own way. She meditated. For hours. She expanded the range of her perception of the threads of life. By the end of the 2nd week, she could sense the threads 100 paces away. Every creature from the rift had a thread too. A thin one, a faint one, inhuman, but visible. Irene could tell where every creature was within 100 paces. A living radar. The morning of the battle. Dan stood before his team. 6 people. Yuna with a bow, Ellie with blades, Hana with light, Daku with a hammer, a battle hammer, one she'd forged for herself, 20 kilograms of steel. Daku carried it with one hand. Irene was unarmed. Her weapon was her eyes. Sora was unarmed. Her job would come after the battle. Dan looked at each of them. He said the plan was simple. Yuna and Ellie would kill the creatures. Hana would blind them and provide cover. Deku would smash whatever the arrows and blades couldn't take down. Irene would keep an eye on the creatures and sound the alarm. Sora stays in the rear with first aid supplies. Dan stands in the center and heals the wounded. He won't attack unless he has to. His job is to keep everyone alive. Yuna nodded. Ellie grunted. Hana clenched her fists. Daku twirled her hammer and smirked. Iron closed her eyes and nodded. Sora stood pale but resolute. They set off. The forest ended at a clearing in front of the rift. The rift hung in the air, a vertical tear in reality. Its edges were jagged and black. A chill and a scent that Dan couldn't describe wafted from the tear. The smell of the inside out. The smell of a world turned inside out. Bones lay scattered around the rift. Deer bones, wolf bones, human bones. No creatures were in sight. Irene said quietly that she sensed 14. 12 small ones, 1 medium-sized one, 1 large one. The Thunderbreaker. Inside the rift. Ellie said the plan was the same. The small ones first, then the medium one. The Thunderbeater last. Yuna fired first. The arrow pierced the throat of a goblin peeking out from behind a rock. It fell without a sound. It had begun. The 12 small creatures took 10 minutes. Yuna took down 5. Ellie took down 3. Daku took out 1 with a single blow from his hammer, driving the creature waist deep into the ground. Hana blinded 2 that were trying to flank them, and Yuna finished them off without looking. 1 creature broke through to Sora, a small goblin. Fast. Vicious. It dudded at her from behind a tree. Sora froze. Her body wouldn't move. Fear. That same nighttime fear from the cellar in Kameni Porog. The goblin leaped, and got hit in the side by a log. Dan stood between it and Sora. He sent the creature flying 5 meters with a single blow. Sora was breathing. Her hands were shaking. Dan didn't look back at her. He just told her to breathe. 1. 2. A medium-sized creature, a lizard, armored, the size of a horse. Yuna's arrows slid off its armor. Ellie couldn't find a gap for her blades. Hana blinded it twice, but the lizard relied on its sense of smell. Daku stepped forward. She raised her hammer. The lizard lunged at her. 20 kilograms of steel met it head-on. The armor cracked. The lizard flew back. It got back up. It staggered. Deku struck again, in the same spot. The armor split open. Yuna fired an arrow into the opening. The lizard collapsed. Silence. 14 minutes. 13 creatures. Not a single injury. Dan exhaled. Then the rift shuddered. A paw emerged from the black crevice. Huge, armored, followed by a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. The Thunder Beast was emerging from the rift. It was bigger than Ellie had described, bigger than a house, as big as a barn, its armor darker than night, eyes like lanterns, 2 spiked tails that sliced through the air with a whistle. The ground shook beneath its paws. Yuna fired. The armor-piercing tip struck the seam between the armor plates on its neck. It penetrated a third of the way. Thunderbeast didn't notice. Ellie swore. Daku raised her hammer. She looked at Groma Boy. She looked at the hammer. The hammer looked like a toy next to that creature. Hana blinded Groma Boy with a beam of light. A flash. The creature roared. It shook its head, blind for 30 seconds. Ellie lunged at it, dived under its belly. Her 2 blades found the seam between the plates on its belly. They went in. Not deep. The Thunderbeast lashed out with its tail. Ellie dodged. Almost. A spike grazed her side. Just a glancing blow. But for a C-rank creature, a glancing blow meant a laceration as long as a palm. Ellie was sent flying. She fell. Blood. Dan was there in 3 seconds. His body moved faster than he thought. Fingerprints. All 5. Tracker, hunter, carpenter, herbalist, midwife. 5 shadows of 5 people worked simultaneously. The tracker's legs, the hunter's reflexes, the carpenter's steadiness. He lifted Ellie, laid her behind a tree, hands on the wound. Mana, in a stream, to stop the bleeding. Ellie hissed through clenched teeth, told him to go and that she was fine. Dan said she was lying, pressed down on the wound. The tissue closed, the bleeding stopped. Sora ran up with bandages. Dan handed Ellie over to her. He stood up. He turned around. Thunderbeater's vision cleared. He saw Yuna in the tree. He saw Hana. He saw Dekka standing in front of him with a hammer. He chose Dekka. He lunged. Deku didn't have time to get out of the way. Thunderbeast knocked her down with a paw. She rolled across the ground. The hammer flew out of her hands. Dan caught the creature. He stood between it and Deku. Thunderbeast loomed over him, 4 meters tall, 1,000 kilograms of armor and muscle. It struck with its paw. Dan took the blow with his arms crossed. The ground beneath his feet sank 20 centimeters. His bones held. HP 1100. Strength 210. A body that had accumulated 1 point of each stat per year of continuous treatment. A body that had no right to withstand that blow. But it did. Thunderbeast struck again. Dan took it. The 3rd blow. He took it. He didn't attack. He held his ground. A wall. A shield. He wasn't a sword, but a wall behind which his team could work. Hana struck with light. Not in the eyes, into Thunderbringer's gaping maw. The light entered. The creature howled. It recoiled. Yuna fired, arrow after arrow, into the seams of the armor plates. 5 arrows. 6. 7. Each one penetrated deeper than the last. Irene could see the Thunder Beast's thread of life, dimming, but it didn't fade. She shouted that the creature was still alive. She shouted that the weak spot was between the 3rd and 4th plates at the back of its head. She could tell by the threads. Where the threads were thinner, the flesh was more vulnerable. Yuna heard her. She rolled along the branch, found a vantage point, pulled the bowstring taut. Deku's armor-piercing arrowhead, 12 paces away, a target the size of a fist. Yuna exhaled. Dan shouted at her to shoot. Now, as you exhale, she can do it. Yuna fired. The arrow entered between the 3rd and 4th plates on Thunderbolt's nape, right into the feathers. The creature froze. Its paws buckled. It collapsed. The ground shook. Silence. Dan lowered his hands. He looked at them. His knuckles were scraped down to the flesh. His forearms were covered in abrasions. 3 strikes from a C-rank creature. He'd taken 3 strikes and was still standing. And he couldn't heal himself. Sora ran up to him. She bandaged his hands, silently, quickly, precisely, just as he taught her. Hana approached. She placed her glowing palms on his forearms. The tissue tightened. The pain was gone. Ellie was lying behind a tree. Sora had already bandaged her. Dekka was sitting on the ground, shaking her head, stunned but unharmed. Irene stood and looked at the rift. She said that the threads of the world around the rift were trembling. She said the rift had weakened. It hadn't closed. It had weakened. Dan approached the rift. He stood before it. A black fissure in reality, ragged edges, cold, the smell of the other side. He raised his hand. He placed his palm on the edge of the rift, a diagnostic gaze, and he saw. The rift was a wound on the body of the world, the same kind of wound as a hunter's torn shoulder, like a ruptured spleen, like a girl's inflamed lungs. A wound. And he knew how to heal wounds. Mana flowed from his hand into the edge of the rift. Warm. Heavy. The threads of the world trembled. They tightened. By a millimeter. 2. 3. The rift narrowed, just a little, almost imperceptibly. But it narrowed. Irene saw it. Her mouth fell open. She whispered that he was stitching it up. Dan withdrew his hand. His mana was at 0. He stood before the rift, breathing heavily. The rift hadn't closed. It was too big, too old. Once wasn't enough. He needed more mana, more strength, more stitches. But he knew now. He knew he could do it. He knew that his profession could do what no one else had been able to do for 300 years. He turned to the team. 6 people stood there, looking at him. Battered, wounded, tired, alive. All alive. He told them they were going home. He told them the rift would have to wait. They set off. Dan brought up the rear. He glanced back at the rift once. The crack in the sky was slightly narrower than it had been that morning, about the width of a finger. The first stitch. 1 year and 8 months after waking up. Summer. Dan stood on the hill near Famakol and looked out at the arc of villages. 10 villages. 1,500 people. Alive. Healthy. On their feet. A year ago, there had been ruins and empty houses here. Now children were running through the streets. Hunters were returning with their catch. The fields were sown. The wells were clean. The walls were sturdy. Deku had built a blacksmith shop in each of the 4 large villages. She had trained apprentices. Yuna had organized a patrol of local hunters. 12 people. Armed. Trained. Ellie set up a network of observation posts along the perimeter. Hana treated patients on her own. She saw patients every day. A line formed at her door first thing in the morning. Sora was growing, faster than Dan had expected. Her diagnostic gaze had become almost as accurate as his. Her mana was growing. Her HP and MP rose with every patient she healed. The same mechanics, the same path. She was the first proof that his method worked not only for him, that any healer could follow this path. All it takes is knowledge and sincerity. Irene was studying the rift. Every week she went to it and looked at the threads of the world. Dan's stitch held. The rift wasn't growing. For the first time in 3 years, the rift wasn't growing. But it wasn't closing either. Dan returned to it every month. He placed his hand on the edge. He channeled mana into it. Another stitch. Another millimeter. The gap was narrowing. Slowly, but it was narrowing. Everything was going according to plan. Everything was going too well. The order of silent mercy struck in early fall. They came at night. Not for Dan, for Sora. They took her from her home in Solyani Kutori, quietly, professionally. Ellie slept through it. For the first time in her 20-year career, she slept through it, because the Order had used sleep magic, S rank, the very same kind that the old man in the black cloak had wielded. In the morning, Ellie stood in the middle of the empty room and looked at Sora's bed. There was a note on the pillow. 3 words. Come alone, Stitcher. Dan read the note. His expression didn't change. His hands didn't tremble. He folded the note, put it in his pocket, turned to the team. Yuna stood with her bow, white as chalk. Hana clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Daku was holding a hammer, and her eyes were wet. Ellie was smoking. She took out her pipe again. Her hands were shaking. She blamed herself. Irene was silent. She could see the threads. Sora's thread. Far away. To the south. Alive. Still alive. Dan said he was going alone. Yuna said no. Hana said no. Deku said no. Ellie said no. Irene said they were idiots if they thought she'd stay. Dan looked at them. He said the note said alone. Ellie threw the pipe on the ground. She said the note was written by someone who didn't know them. He said they were all going. Dan wanted to argue. He looked at the 6 faces. He didn't. He nodded. They walked for 2 days. Irene led the way, following Sora's trail. South, beyond the rift, into lands that had been empty for 5 years. They found an old temple in the mountains. Stone. Ancient. The walls were covered with symbols that Hana recognized. Symbols of the profession. Old ones. The ones that existed before the cuts. Inside the temple they were waiting. 20 people in black cloaks. The Order of Silent Mercy. And among them was that very old man, the head of the order. He stood by the altar. Behind him, on a stone slab, lay Sora, bound, pale, alive. The old man looked at Dan. He looked at the 6 behind him. He said the invitation was for 1 person. Dan said he wasn't a good reader. The old man smiled, a cold smile. He said it didn't matter. He said the ritual required a Stitcher, alive, on the altar. His sacrifice would open the great rift and release the one waiting on the other side. An ancient god. The one who opened the first rifts 300 years ago and got stuck between worlds. The one who curtailed the healer's profession so that no one could close his doors. Dan listened. The pieces were falling into place. 300 years ago, someone opened the rifts, on purpose. That someone was the Stitcher, the strongest of them all. He used his profession in reverse, not to stitch, but to tear. And he got stuck, between worlds, half alive, half dead. Ever since then, the rifts haven't closed because he's keeping them open from there. Ever since then, the profession has been curtailed because his followers inscribed lies in the temple records. Ever since then, the Order of Silent Mercy has been waiting for a Stitcher strong enough for his sacrifice to break through the wall between the worlds. And Duke Karan knew. Not everything, but enough. He knew that the healer's profession was dangerous. He knew that a true healer could close the rifts. And the rifts are business. The rifts are the spoils. The rifts are the foundation of the kingdom's economy. Without the rifts, there are no hunters. Without hunters, there are no guilds. Without guilds, there is no college. Without the college, there is no Duke Karan. Karan didn't work for the Order. Karan worked for himself. But their interests aligned. Neither of them wanted the rifts to close. Dan stood in the temple doorway. 20 members of the Order stood between him and Sora. An S-rank elder stood at the altar. He looked at Sora. She was looking at him. Her eyes were clear. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She lay on the cold stone and looked at him. She believed he would come. And he did. Dan took off his cloak. Beneath it was a thin, boyish body. Narrow shoulders. Slender arms. A gray F-rank mark flickered above his head. HP 40. MP 15. A lie. He turned to Yuna. Told her to shoot when he gave the signal. Turned to Hana. Told her to be ready to cast a spell on his command. He turned to Dek. He told him to destroy everything that moved. He turned to Ellie. He told her to take Sora off the altar when the way was clear. He turned to Iron. He told her to keep everyone in check. If anyone tried to leave, stop them. 5 minutes. He'd handle it in 5 minutes. Then he looked at the 20 men in black cloaks and stepped inside. The first member of the order lunged at him with a blade. Dan stepped aside. The tracker's imprint. He intercepted the arm. The hunter's imprint. He threw him over his hip. The warrior's imprint. The one he'd healed 4 months ago. The second. The third. He moved like no one in this world had ever seen. A healer who moved like an assassin. Dodged like a scout. Struck like a warrior. Hundreds of small talents. Hundreds of shadows. Hundreds of people he had healed. Each imprint was weak. A student's. But there were many of them, and they added up. A mage of the order hurled a fireball. Dan dove beneath it. The imprint of an acrobat he'd healed from a broken ankle. He straightened up. He struck the mage in the chest with his palm. A surge of mana. Not healing. Diagnostic. The mage's heart skipped a beat. The mage fell. Not dead. Unconscious. Dan didn't kill. He knocked them out. Each one. Precisely. His diagnostic gaze revealed weak spots, nerve centers, pain points. Areas where a single touch of mana would shut down consciousness. A medic knows the body. A medic knows how the body breaks. Dan knew how to shut down a body without breaking it. Hannah blinded a group of 5 with a single flash. Yuna took out 2 with arrows to the legs. Not to kill, to the legs. Deku charged into the fray like a hurricane. The hammer sang, bones crunched. Not to kill either. Deku struck with precision. To the hands, in the legs, on their weapons. She'd forged the hammer for 3 days, and every blow was as precise as a strike on an anvil. Ellie vanished. She reappeared at the altar. She cut the ropes binding Sora's hands. She lifted her up. Sora wrapped her arms around Ellie's neck and wouldn't let go. Ellie held her close and said, "It's okay, little one. It's okay." The walk from the door to the altar took 4 minutes. 18 members of the order lay on the floor. Alive. All alive. A healer doesn't kill. The old man remained. S rank. He stood by the altar and looked at Dan. He didn't attack. He just watched. Then he spoke. He said he was impressed. He said the boy was indeed a Stitcher. He said that would make the sacrifice all the more valuable. He raised his hand. Dark energy gathered in his palm. Dan felt the pressure. Powerful. Overwhelming. S rank was a different level. A different league. A different reality. Dan couldn't fight him. No one on his team could. And the old man knew it. But Dan wasn't going to fight. He took a step forward. A second. A third. He walked straight toward the old man. Unarmed. Unprotected. The dark energy struck him in the chest. Pain exploded inside him. His HP plummeted. 1,100. 900. 700. He kept walking. 500. 400. He kept walking. Hannah screamed. She cast light on him, healed him on the fly. His HP stabilized. Irene grabbed hold of his lifeline, held on, wouldn't let him go. Dan kept walking. The old man struck again. Dan fell to one knee. He got up. He kept going. The old man struck a third time. Dan fell. He got up. He kept going. He reached the old man. He raised his hand. He placed his palm on the old man's chest. The old man froze, a diagnostic gaze. And Dan saw it. The old man was sick. 300 years of waiting had eaten him up from the inside. His organs were held together by magic. Without magic, he'd crumble in a minute. His body was a ruin. Dan told him quietly that he was dying. He said his body was destroyed. He said no god could save him. He said that if he wanted, Dan could ease the pain. The old man looked at him. Something flickered in his eyes, something ancient and weary. He said he'd been waiting 300 years. Dan said 300 years was enough. The old man lowered his hand. The dark energy dissipated. He sat down on the floor, slowly, like a man who'd finally allowed himself to grow tired. Dan sat down beside him. He placed a hand on his shoulder. Mana flowed. Not healing mana, pain-relieving mana, relieving what had built up over 300 years. The old man closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 centuries, he felt no pain. He whispered that the Stitcher who had opened the rifts was his teacher. He said that the teacher had wanted power. He tore the world apart to get it, and got stuck. And ever since, the Order has been waiting, because the teacher promised to return. Dan listened. Then he said the teacher wouldn't return. He said he would close the fissures. That was it. He said the world would be mended. The old man opened his eyes. He looked at the boy with the gray mark. Then he nodded, and his life force faded, quietly, peacefully, like a candle in the wind. Irene let go. 3 centuries had ended. They left the temple. Sora walked between Ellie and Deku. She held onto both of them. She wouldn't let go. Yuna walked ahead, her bow on her back. Hana walked beside Dan. Irene brought up the rear. 7 of them, alive. All 7. Dan looked back at the temple. Ancient symbols on the stones. The binder. His real name. His name. He turned and headed north. Home. But he couldn't get home right away. Halfway there, a messenger met them. From Huamakol. Grandfather Yun had sent him. The messenger said that soldiers from the college had arrived in the village. He said they had orders from Duke Karan, the arrest of Daniel So for illegal healing practices, heresy, subversion of the state order, execution in the capital square. Dan listened. He nodded. He said he understood. Ellie said they had to run, west, to another kingdom. Karan wouldn't be able to reach them there. Dan shook his head. He said he wouldn't run. Ellie said they'd kill him. Dan said that if he ran, Karan would go after the villages, after the people he'd healed, after the old people and children standing behind the walls that Deku had built. He wouldn't run. Yuna was silent. Hana was silent. Deku was silent. Sora held his hand. She wouldn't let go. Irene said his thread was strong, the strongest she'd ever seen. Dan smiled. He surrendered. Without a fight. He let them put the chains on him. The college's soldiers led him north, toward the capital. Ellie vanished that very night. Yuna went into the forest. Hana flew ahead. Deku returned to the villages. Sora followed the convoy, from a distance, quietly, like a shadow. Irene walked beside Dan. The soldiers didn't touch her. A necromancer. They were afraid. Dan walked in chains along the road to the capital, counting his steps. Every step closer to the square. Every step closer to the scaffold. He wasn't afraid. He was afraid for them. For Yuna, who was now running through the forest. For Hana, who was flying toward the capital. For Dika, who was gathering people. For Sora, who must not see him being led to his death. For Ellie, who was hatching some plan, and her plan was surely madness. The capital greeted him with a gray sky, the square in front of the cathedral, the podium, the scaffold, the executioner, the crowd. Duke Karan on the podium, a white cloak, a silver chain, a noble face, calm. He read out the sentence. Illegal practice, heresy, subversion of order, death by beheading. Dan stood on the scaffold in chains. He looked at the crowd. Thousands of faces. And among them, in the front row, Grandfather Yoon Gisup, on foot. Hundreds of kilometers. Old legs. A sore knee. He stood there, watching Dan. Next to him was the mother of the girl from Hamakal, the one who'd had pneumonia. Next to her was Beck from Speckled Bend, whose arm had healed properly. Next to her was the mother of the boy from Dry Creek, who'd been saved from meningitis. Next to her was the fishmonger, the very same one, from the very first day. An old woman with deformed hands, the woman whose heart he had restarted in the market square a year and 10 months ago. She stood in the front row and looked at him. The executioner raised his sword. The crowd was silent. And then, the fishmonger stepped forward, silently. She took her shawl off her shoulders, an old one, a mended one, her only valuable possession, and she placed it on the block in front of Dan. Grandfather Yun stepped forward after her. He took off his hat. He placed it there. Behind him, the girl's mother, a headscarf. Behind her, Beck, a belt. Behind them, more, and more, and more. People stepped out of the crowd, one after another. They placed their belongings on the chopping block. Shawls, headscarves, belts, jackets, scarves, children's mittens. Hundreds of people, thousands, without words, without shouting, without weapons. They simply laid down their belongings and spoke with a single gesture, a gesture that could only be understood through us. Karan turned pale. The guards froze. The executioner lowered his sword. The square was littered with rags and clothing and a silence louder than any scream. And then Hana's voice rang out from the cathedral's roof, amplified by the magic of light, clear, ringing, soaring over the square. She was telling her story, about the healer's profession, about her real name, the Stitcher, about how she had been disfigured 300 years ago, about how the boy on the chopping block had restored her power, about how he could seal the rifts, about how the college knew this, and that was precisely why they wanted him dead. Deku knocked out the bolt on the dungeon beneath the square. Hostages from the villages were being held there, 6 elderly men whom Karan had taken as collateral. Deku smashed the door open with a single blow of his hammer and led them out into the light. Yuna stood on the roof of the building across the street. 3 of the college's archers on the cathedral's towers were aiming at the crowd. Yuna took all 3 down, arrows in their hands. Not fatally. They dropped their bows, bewildered as to where the shots had come from. Ellie was working below. She knew the capital. She knew every alleyway. She was leading people away from the square through safe streets, quietly, professionally, so that when the stampede began, no one would die. Sora and Irene stood at the edge of the square. 2 wounded people were already lying there. The stampede was beginning. Sora was bandaging them. Irene was holding the threads of those who were weakening. A 15-year-old girl and a necromancer worked side by side, and their hands didn't tremble. And Dan stood on the block, in chains. He didn't move, because if he moved, if he broke the chains, if he unleashed the power he'd been hiding for nearly 2 years, a massacre would begin. The guards would strike. People would suffer. He stood motionless and looked at Karan across the square. Karan stood on the podium. His face was ashen. He was losing. He knew it. But he couldn't back down, because backing down would mean admitting that the boy was right, that the Collegium was lying, that his entire life was built on a monopoly that kills people. Dan spoke, calmly, quietly. In the voice of a paramedic, the very one that calms panicked people in burning cars. He told the Duke he had arrhythmia. He said he could hear it from here, an irregular heartbeat, skipped beats. He told him to sit down. He said he didn't want him to die before the trial. Karan opened his mouth. He closed it. His hand jerked toward his chest. He knew about his arrhythmia. He'd known for 20 years. The college's best healers couldn't cure it. But the boy on the block heard it across the square. And then the gray mark above Dan's head flickered. It went out and flared up again. Not gray, white. Bright. Unbearably bright. The entire square saw it. Thousands of people looked up. Above the chained boy burned an inscription the world hadn't seen in 3 centuries. The Stitcher. Rank, undetermined. Silence. Absolute silence. 1,000 people and not a single sound. Then the inspector in the 3rd row, an old guild fighter with a gray mustache, slowly took off his cap. Silently. Behind him, a 2nd. Then a 3rd. Row after row, caps came off like a wave. The college soldiers lowered their weapons. The executioner laid his sword on the ground. Karan stood on the platform, and his world was crumbling around him. Dan stood on the block, in chains he could have broken with a single movement. He didn't break them. He didn't need to. He stood and looked at the fishmonger, who had been the first to lay down her shawl. She was looking at him. She was smiling, toothless, old, alive. He had saved her life on the first day. She had saved his life on the last. Snow began to fall. The first snow of the 2nd winter. White. Silent. It settled on the block, on the shawls, on the square, on the heads of thousands of people who stood in silence, gazing at the inscription burning in the gray sky. The Stitcher. The one who mends. People. The world. Rifts. Everything. Dan closed his eyes. 1, 2, 1, 2. The same words, the same calm, the same voice that had once said to the dying guy in the burning car, "Breathe with me, buddy." He breathed, and the world breathed with him.